Hey guys, tonight we begin not with some grand conqueror or deep thinker, but with a plant that is quietly confused for thousands of years. This remarkable plant has shaped medicine, culture, and history. So before you settle in too deeply, maybe give this a quick, like if the vibe feels right, and subscribe only if you actually enjoy drifting through these long, hazy stories. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's strangely comforting to picture people scattered across the world tuning in at the same moment. Now ease back, dim the lights a little more, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle white noise. Let's float gently into this smoky corner of history together. We're stepping back roughly 5,000 years before the Common Era, deep into the Stone Age, when everything still felt rough and unfinished. Civilization was basically in prototype mode. People were shaping basic pots, taming a handful of animals, and dropping from things as ordinary as an infected bug bite. Somewhere in what we now call Siberia, a traveler likely tossed a bundle of dried plants onto a fire to produce extra warmth, inhaled the smoke deeply, and suddenly couldn't quite remember why they were standing there in the cold. Later, archaeological excavations revealed seeds deliberately placed within ancient graves, which suggests someone cared enough about the plant to send it along with the dead. It could have been part of a solemn ritual or simply an early version of not wanting to leave your favorite things behind. Knowing how people are, it was probably a bit of both. In those earliest days, it wasn't about chasing pleasure or profound thoughts. It was pure practicality. The tough fibers became strong ropes and rough clothing. The seeds provided decent nutrition. The whole plant worked like nature's all purpose tool. You could lash a shelter together with it, rig a simple boat, weave garments, and if a little got burnt by accident, the sky might suddenly seem more interesting than usual. Picture being one of the very first to deliberately breathe it in. No instructions, no snacks prepared, no music in the background, just pure bewilderment and perhaps a long, one sided conversation with a nearby boulder. Those early users probably didn't describe it as getting high. They likely felt the spirits had simply sharpened their eyesight for a moment, and from that single curious inhale, a legend quietly took root, a plant destined to wander the earth, inspire verses, stir unease, and eventually bankroll entire musical movements, all because some Neolithic forager wondered what would happen if he set fire to part of the harvest. So long before anyone had a word for it, this plant had already outmaneuvered humanity. It hooked the one creature foolish enough to cultivate it, revere it, outlaw it, and inhale it, sometimes all within the same lifetime. Humans, congratulations on your longest and most complicated relationship. Let's drift forward to around 2700 BCE, when China was busy inventing half the foundations of civilized life: paper, fine textiles, early bureaucracy, and what appears to be the first official record of using this plant for healing. Meet Emperor Shen Nung, remembered as the divine cultivator, a title that sounds grand until you realize his daily routine mostly involved tasting random wild plants to determine which ones were poisonous. He was essentially humanity's original solo experimenter, no safety net, no backup team. Legend says Shen Nung cataloged hundreds of herbs this way, including ginseng preparations and, yes, cannabis. His work, the Pen Cao Qing, functions like an ancient review guide for greenery, helpful against aches, joint stiffness, rheumatism, and even absent mindedness, which is ironic because cannabis might well have contributed to some of that fog he was trying to lift. To him, it wasn't a flaw, it was a remedy. The Chinese didn't smoke it in circles or pass it around casually. They steeped it into drinks, powdered it, and gave it dignified names like Essence of the Wandering Winds. It soothed inflammation, steadied moods, and occasionally made people a little too confident in their own verse. By then, hemp was already everywhere, twisted into cords, sewn into garments, pressed into early paper. Whole communities were practically constructed around it. Your clothing, your riding surface, your fishing traps, and if luck was kind, your gentle relief from discomfort. It must have felt like living inside a sustainable haze. Healers approached it with gravity. They believed it harmonized inner forces, which is a refined way of saying it simply mellowed you out. It wasn't yet for leisure, but any group that claims something is purely spiritual usually ends up quietly laughing at nothing in particular. While much of the world was still figuring out consistent fire and questionable decisions, China had quietly slotted cannabis into its healing toolkit. Shen Nung may not have understood compounds like THC, but he grasped one essential truth. It quieted complaints for a while, and in an era filled with scarcity, sudden floods, and distant threats gathering strength, that counted as genuine progress. While China bottled cannabis into tonics under the guise of strict health protocols, their nomadic neighbors across the Central Asian steppes took a more straightforward approach. They simply threw it on hot stones and inhaled deeply. Enter the Scythians, those horse-riding wanderers who seemed perpetually camped out, perpetually weary, and perpetually armed, yet somehow unbothered. Around 1000 BCE, they decided funerals needed an extra element, smoke, not mild incense or fragrant herbs, but cannabis. The Greek writer Herodotus described how they would scatter hemp seeds onto heated rocks inside sealed hide tents. Soon the enclosed space thickened with scented vapor, and as he put it, they would shout in delight, which in ancient Greek basically means someone is about to improvise poetry under the open sky. This wasn't casual inhalation, it was full immersion. Imagine a group of tattooed warriors in furs, squeezing into a sealed enclosure with smoldering hemp, then stumbling back out, feeling spiritually renewed and slightly disoriented. The Scythians had no exact word for relaxation, but this came close. The fumes carried meaning. They eased conversations with departed ancestors, softened grief, and frankly painted the afterlife in rather appealing colors. Later, excavations uncovered actual gold pipes in Scythian burial mounds, still bearing traces of cannabis residue. These ancient fighters departed exactly as they had lived, elegant, enigmatic, and faintly elevated. That's the sort of commitment history can't put a price on. Other groups soon adopted the practice. From Persian territories to Indian regions, nomads and seers began drawing cannabis vapors during rites, gatherings, and late-night contemplations. Because pondering the nature of existence becomes noticeably easier when the air itself starts offering suggestions. While the Chinese boiled their cures and pondered equilibrium, the Scythians refined the enclosed smoke ritual. No elaborate ceremonies, no added fragrances, just fire, vapor, and a silent understanding that nobody lifts the tent flap until someone begins seeing deities. While the Scythians were sealing tents on the vast steppes, India had already elevated cannabis to something sacred, because if inhaling smoke led to visions, it made sense to frame it as divine wisdom. Around 1500 years before the Common Era, cannabis appeared in the Atharva Veda, one of Hinduism's ancient holy texts. It was named among 5 sacred plants, a gift from the heavens, particularly tied to Shiva, who legend says found it beneath a celestial tree, took a draw, and slipped into godly repose. From then on, Shiva carried the title Lord of Bhang, easily the most memorable sacred name ever bestowed. Bhang itself wasn't inhaled, it was consumed as a drink. Picture a blend of milk, spices, ground leaves, and a subtle awakening. Priests, ascetics, and festival participants sipped it during rituals, honored the divine, and then midway through often lost track of the honor itself. It wasn't seen as defiant or forbidden. It was blessed. In temples, cannabis purified the essence. In villages, it helped endure family gatherings. Remedy, contemplation, and gentle retreat all wrapped in one leaf. Festivals like Mahashivratri became heavenly celebrations, devotees staying awake through the night chanting, swaying, sipping bhang until the cosmos seemed to hum. If insight had a formula, this was it. One measure faith, one measure plant, and one regrettable morning after. While other cultures treated cannabis as a tool for ceremony or trade, India gave it soul whimsical, ethereal, deeply human, not mere foliage. A companion on the journey toward grasping everything, or at least pretending to. The appeal lay in no pretense of pure wellness. It was plainly for bliss, elevation, and sometimes overlooking a long, dry season. As the world coughed in enclosures, India lifted cannabis to godly status. They didn't just partake, they sanctified it. Here, rising wasn't escape, it was wisdom with nicer treats. While India joyfully toasted Shiva with bhang drinks, China took a more solemn stance, because their even transcendence required records. Around 1,000 years before the Common Era, cannabis wove into Taoist practices a blend of quiet reflection, elixir searches, and odd cave pursuits for eternal life. Taoist hermits believed cannabis, fumes in burners, connected them to spirits and glimpses ahead, which, if experienced, might dazzle briefly before turning unsettling for hours. In their writings, cannabis earned tags like releaser of burdens, uplifting, until it also led folks to chase mists in forests. Monks ignited it for meditations, claiming it unlocked perception gates, meaning they grew so elevated their pulse echoed around. China's bond with cannabis was nuanced, not festivity fair, philosophical. Taoists sought not flight, but harmony with existence, fancy phrasing for let's elevate until the world feels like a familiar acquaintance. Yet early Chinese were too structured for disarray. Cannabis got measured precisely, blended with herbs noted in scrolls that likely carried faint regret scents. You didn't ignite casually. You followed steps, reflected, and hoped not to bump walls while drifting. Confucians, those constant downers, scowled at mind looseness. Taoists claimed it widened awareness. Confucians said it bred idleness. History's initial substance debate ending as they do, folks nodding agreement and ignoring it privately. All along, cannabis stayed China's mystic silent ally, ignited in halls, examined by sages, blamed for a misplaced text or two. Outcome? A culture that turned elevation into ethical, thoughtful, administrative ritual. Only China could breathe the vast, but insist on proper paperwork first. By this stage, cannabis secured its spot in human tales, not as enigma, herb, or sly habit, but as the persistent plant no one could ditch. You could inhale it, don it, scribe on it, construct with it, and nibble if desperate. Ancient world's all-purpose blade, but instead of uncorking it, uncorked thoughts now and then. In old China, hemp wasn't merely handy, it saturated life. Growers planted vast swaths. Locals spun threads. Scribes made paper. Earliest wisdoms edged on hemp, so civilization literally rested on cannabis. Somewhere Taoist inhaling the plant, another scripted stop inhaling this on. Fibers were famed, robust, lasting, rot-resistant. Hemp lines secured nets, bound vessels, occasionally held those too lofty, post-smoking the rest. Hemp attire outlasted bonds and felt only mildly scratchy. Didn't end there. Finds show hemp footwear, bow cords, even battle padding, since nothing screams ready like a fighter clad in cannabis. Possibly in force advanced to clash, hemp encased, unaware they warred in history's original green outpost. As it traveled west via trades, it claimed lands without effort. Persians crafted lines. Egyptians mixed salves, Greeks debated ethics over drinks. All relied on it, all craved it, all feigned ignorance of Weaver's constant cheer. Hemp turned silent realm shaper. No blades or troops, just toughness bent and subtle aroma lingering eras. While rulers vied for riches, hemp lingered patient for recall. And they did, not for quartz or pages, but fumes. Utility era faded. Leisure insight dawned. When cannabis reached ancient Persia, it had been cure core than vapor. Persians, being themselves, decided it ought to reveal cosmic truths, since their even uplift needed study. Assyrians used it first routinely, naming it kunnabu, echoing cannabis, because they burned it in sacred spaces, not for kicks, but insight, which is priestly lingo for we're about to sense use. Once in full Persian hands, cannabis nestled among Zoroastrian seers with flame sights, dual worlds, and deep unease. Lacked only uplift boost. They held smoke, bore pleased skyward fare with a few thoughts too. Philosophers abounded, fond of circled debates, on essence till questions blurred. Cannabis slotted in, eased hurts, softened edges, made endless truth, chats bearable. Old tales say some clerics used it in rites to banish doubt. Today all clicks, but not all endorsed. Elites sniffed trouble. If divinity came free of dues, order might crumble. So cannabis started its suspicious arc, honored quietly, decried openly, shared behind burners. Persian merchants pushed it west on silk paths, gaining labels, rights, and fame for thoughtful disorder. By Greece it wasn't planned. It was roving notion, portable inside pack, sans guide. Persia made cannabis deep, turned mist to soul, musing to contest, planned to debate, buddy. Like great talks ended same. Wait, what was the point? As cannabis meandered down the Nile, Egypt ran on godly admin. Deities had duties, clerics, forms, all building tombs, sans fair work rules. Cannabis arrived small grace for an overtaxed society millennia in. Egyptians practical, skipped Scythian smokes or Indian sips. Used it healing-wise, meaning claimed medicine then applied everywhere. Shows in Ebers scroll 3,500-year medalist cannabis for swelling eye pressure, cycle pains, and truly foul moods. That alone might have averted pharaonic feuds. Priests guarded used blending balms, oils, temple scents. See a head cleric swinging a fuming censer, insisting spiritual. Sure, like ale. Sweet odor carried appeals to immortals and likely brought temple folk nearer. Cannabis reached afterlives. Traces in wraps and chambers, so someone thought eternity calls for this. Hard to fault. Forever's lengthy beyond, rumored to involve toil again. Women employed it. Midwives ordered cannabis for birth ease bold, sans numbing just chance, and snuck herbs. Hear the counsel, breathe majesty and hand the salve. Nobles partook, pharaohs adored luxuries, cannabis rubs for crown headaches, maybe from literal weight or endless build meets. Egyptians didn't erect just stones, they crafted copes. Cannabis wasn't uprising, survival gear. When deities demand flawlessness, weather demands toil, workers drop in heat, a green sprig seems heavenly gift. As cannabis floated into ancient Greece, the locals had mastered their two favorite pastimes, arguing about everything and drinking while doing it. Naturally, a plant that nudged both introspection and gentle chaos fit right in. The Greeks didn't invent cannabis. They just turned it into another topic for endless discussion. To them, nothing truly existed until it had been debated, labeled, and debated again over wine. So the philosophical friendship between weed and wisdom began, or as Plato might have phrased it in a quieter moment, the Republic of Calm. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Dioscorides mentioned cannabis in their medical writings, praising its help with inflammations, ear troubles, and what they called inner pains, which could very well have been the earliest recorded case of existential ache. They weren't exactly passing joints beneath the Parthenon, but the plant was certainly around, likely discussed in that grave, overly serious tone that made even the mundane sound profound. Imagine a symposium, low lights, cups of diluted wine, philosophers reclining on couches, someone casually wondering aloud if reality might be an illusion. Nods all around, more debate, and perhaps a discreet cough from the corner because someone overdid the medicinal incense. The Greeks didn't treat cannabis as scandalous. They saw it as natural. It grew wild, eased ailments, and occasionally brought the kind of sudden clarity that ruins friendships. Soldiers used hemp for wound dressings, while thinkers probably used it to sharpen logic or at least wound it in interesting ways. Even Herodotus, the ancient world's enthusiastic travel writer, described the Scythians and their joyful vapors with a mix of fascination and that classic Greek superiority. They admired it, sure, but pretended they were above such things. You know, the way people today admire silent retreats but never actually attend one. Greek philosophers didn't need cannabis to think deeply. They already questioned gods, laws, morality, and why sandals always pinched. The plant just made those questions feel momentarily more urgent. So while Athens argued about virtue in the agora somewhere in a shaded garden, a lesser known thinker probably stared at an olive tree for 2 solid hours and murmured, "I believe it understands me." And honestly, that's about as Greek as it gets. When the Roman Empire wasn't busy absorbing other people's lands, it quietly absorbed their plans too. Cannabis slipped into Rome almost unnoticed, traveling trade routes and never quite leaving. The Romans didn't worship it the way Indians did or philosophize it like the Greeks. They simply used it, grumbled about it, and wrote practical manuals on how to do both better. To a Roman, cannabis was utility first. Hemp fibers made ropes, sails, tents, vital equipment for an empire that never stopped marching somewhere new. Hemp lines dragged ships across the sea-bound captives and sometimes served as makeshift clotheslines for tunics soaked in post-battle regret. If Rome ever had an unofficial motto for logistics, it might have been, I saw I tied it down with hemp. Doctors appreciated it as well. The same Dioscorides, yes, the Greek one. Rome simply borrowed, along with everything else, recommended cannabis for ear pain, gut joint stiffness, which probably covered about half the population after decades of marching, fighting, and public banquets. It was also said to dampen sexual desire, the sort of side effect that instantly made it unpopular in the Senate. Roman women, meanwhile, used cannabis infused oils for skin softening and what were politely called female discomforts. Considering the state of Roman sanitation and diet, that oil was likely the kindest thing their bodies encountered all year. But don't picture marble statues casually toking in the forum. For Romans, intoxication carried moral weight. Wine was civilized. Hashish felt foreign and suspicious. Anything that made you too content without paying taxes was automatically questionable. So while hemp was everywhere, practical, dependable, actually inhaling cannabis remained something for outsiders, mystics, and that one uncle who never stopped talking about constellations. Even so, it spread through the empire the way gossip moves through a bathhouse. Roman legions carried hemp seeds to far provinces, unknowingly turning swaths of Europe into future growing fields for the world's most adaptable plant. From Britain to North Africa, cannabis took root quietly, stubbornly, the way every idea Rome tried to control eventually did. While emperors raised toasts with wine and philosophers debated virtue humble, hemp quietly held the empire together literally. Sails, scrolls, ropes, remedies, all thanks to a plant no one wanted to admit they quietly respected. Rome eventually fell, but cannabis didn't. It simply waited patient and green for the next power to claim it had discovered something new. By the time the Silk Road reached its golden era, cannabis had accomplished what most empires only dreamed of: total worldwide spread without firing a single arrow. No legions, no sieges, just merchants carrying good hemp and even better stories. Picture a caravan snaking through Central Asian deserts. Camels groaning under loads, traders wiping sweat spices, scenting the dry air, and tucked somewhere in the baggage, a sack of cannabis seeds politely labeled for medicinal trade, the ancient equivalent of plausible deniability. Along those routes, the plant kept changing shape. In China, it stayed medicine and paper. In India, holy. In Persia, philosophical. By the time it reached the broader Middle East and parts of Africa, it had become hashish compact, strong, and far more enjoyable than most religious rules permitted. Merchants didn't trade only silk and pepper, they traded culture. Every caravan stop turned into an exchange of tales, ideas, and the occasional drifting cloud of sweet smoke. You could hear Sanskrit chants blending with Persian couplets, while someone in the background rediscovered the concept of enclosed inhalation. Along the way, the legend of the assassins of Alamut took hold, a secretive Persian sect said to use hashish before political killings. Chroniclers, mostly nervous Europeans, claimed the drug made them fearless and fanatical. The reality is murkier. They were probably just very good at strategy and occasionally enjoyed the plant, but the rumor stuck and Hashishin slowly morphed into our modern word assassin, a 900-year linguistic souvenir born from paranoia and creative slander. Further along the route, Arab physicians studied cannabis in careful texts, calling it both a cure for sadness and a risk to self-control, which, to be fair, still describes it rather accurately. Traders themselves learned a timeless business lesson. People will always pay a premium for anything that makes a 9-month camel journey feel shorter. The Silk Road turned cannabis into the first truly borderless plant. It crossed tongues, faiths, and ethical lines without apology. And everyone pretended their use was strictly therapeutic. Whether you were a monk in a Chinese temple, a merchant resting in Samarkand, or a mystic in Cairo, the scent remained the same: smoke dust and a faint promise of understanding. Cannabis had gone global, and there was no undoing it. By the Islamic Golden Age, cannabis had become the polite guest, no one officially invited, but everyone allowed to stay. From Baghdad to Cairo, it drifted quietly through mosques, palaces, and late-night poetry gatherings, never shouted about, always present. The early Islamic world was bursting with invention: mathematics, star charts, medicine, philosophy, and a plant that made long nights of debate feel just a little more inspired. Scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi included cannabis in their medical encyclopedias, noting its help with pain digestion and soothing the temperament, which in medieval terms meant take some and stop arguing theology for an hour. But Islam's relationship with intoxication was complicated. The Quran clearly forbade wine. Cannabis? It stayed silent on the matter. That silence left space for interpretation, and humans have never needed much encouragement to find loopholes. So hashish rose as the original gray area of divine law. Sufi mystics embraced it completely. These were the poets and whirling dervishes of Islam, the ones who spun in circles claiming union with the divine through chant rhythm and occasionally something that made the divine seem unusually talkative. For Sufis, cannabis wasn't sin. It was a fragrant bridge to the eternal, a slightly giggly bridge, but a bridge nonetheless. Meanwhile, the official religious authorities disapproved. Hashish dens appeared from Egypt to Persia, filled with scholars, merchants, and people who were definitely supposed to be somewhere else. Preachers called it the plant of laziness. Rulers issued bans, yet every prohibition failed, largely because the people enforcing them kept needing to personally examine large quantities of confiscated material. By the 13th century, hashish had become the era's worst-kept secret. Poets praised it in verse. Doctors prescribed it. Beggars smoked it in alleys. Everyone had an opinion, and half of them forgot the opinion halfway through forming it. While much of Europe was still occasionally burning people for heresy and rarely bathing, the Islamic world quietly debated whether cannabis drew you nearer to God or simply nearer to a long nap. Either way, the outcome was similar: a civilization reaching the height of its creativity, possibly while feeling a little lighter than usual. Somewhere in the rugged mountains of 11th century Persia, cannabis earned its first serious public relations headache. The story begins with a secretive group called the Nizari Ismailis. They built fortified castles, irritated empires, and occasionally removed inconvenient political figures with precision. Their leader, Hassan Isaba, governed from a mountain stronghold called Alamut, roughly translating to Eagle's Nest, because murder headquarters didn't quite have the same ring. According to medieval rumor, his followers, later called Hashashin, would smoke hashish before missions, entering a blissful state of divine certainty before striking. Chroniclers swore the drug made them fearless, loyal, and very effective with blades. It's a gripping tale. It's also almost certainly exaggerated. There's no solid evidence these men used hashish before operations. The myth was likely spread by their enemies, who found it easier to blame drugs than admit a small group of mountain-based scholars kept outmaneuvering entire armies. Calling them drugged zealots was simpler than admitting superior planning. But stories spread faster than truth in any age. European crusaders carried the tales home, whispering of Eastern killers lost in strange herbal trances. The word Hashashin drifted through languages until it became our modern word assassin. And just like that, a religious sect, a military tactic, and a plant fused into one enduring headline that lasted nearly a millennium. Ironically, the Nizaris were more often librarians, engineers, and diplomats than fanatics. They built libraries, signed treaties, and killed only when strategy demanded it, which, to be fair, was still fairly often. The idea they got high before missions probably came from the same sources who believed Ethiopia housed dragons. Still, the label stuck. Hashish became forever linked with hidden violence, even though the real connection was medieval propaganda and a shortage of fact-checking. So the next time someone says the word assassin, remember it began as an over-the-top rumor about a group of educated Persians who may or may not have appreciated herbal incense. The myth outlived the castles. Cannabis gained a new shadow, and humanity, as usual, learned precisely nothing from the experience. By the time this plant made its way into medieval Europe, the continent had perfected a system for dealing with unfamiliar ideas. Fear them, outlaw them, then use them in secret anyway. Hemp had been around for ages as cord, lubricant, and cloth. No one batted an eye. But the instant someone chose to ignite it rather than weave it, the church stepped in. To be fair, medieval Europe wasn't in the mood for new experiments. With holy wars, crop failures, and plagues wiping out chunks of the population, folks were hanging on by a thread. The church oversaw laws, healing, and one's path to heaven, and it wasn't keen on anything that made the faithful chuckle during Mass. Still, the plant found cracks to slip through. Monks cultivated hemp in abbey plots for writing material and ritual cords, all while penning stern warnings about questionable herbs. It's reasonable to think at least one brother sampled the crop and experienced the deep moment of clarity involving a flickering candle and endless chants. By the 13th century, healers and herbalists were discreetly offering plant extracts for aches, fevers, and what they tactfully termed women's concerns. It helped, which naturally made it dubious. Any relief that bypassed prayer raised flags and often led to flames. The church liked its wonders from above, not from the garden. Travelers from the Holy Wars brought tales of Eastern gathering places, shadowy chambers full of content souls not at war. Europe found this alarming. Writers described outsiders inhaling strange vapors, meaning they seemed at ease, which was obviously unholy. Soon, the plant joined the church's list of disfavors: old rituals, dissent, literate women, and now unexplained smiles. Formally, it became a symbol of forbidden practices. Informally, midwives, herb experts, and those with lingering pains kept using it. Europe took a useful plant and spun it into ethical turmoil. a talent it hasn't lost. Hemp remained acceptable if it stayed practical, but hint at enjoyment and it faced exile. So began Europe's enduring habit of fearing and relying on the same thing. By the late Middle Ages, this versatile material had outlasted what most couldn't. Empires rising and crumbling, languages evolving, societies vanishing in time, and yet it kept appearing wherever human effort met need. People found countless ways to rely on it, and it became a quiet backbone of everyday life. It traveled with explorers to new lands, supporting work and trade. In a sense, it journeyed across continents on its own accord. Still, its reputation stayed divided. To laborers, it was essential. To scholars, it served practical purposes. To the faithful, it could raise concern. Every circle depended on it, distrusted it, or both, which sums up much of history. In the Renaissance, as thinkers explored bodies, ideas, and society, it returned to daily life and workshops for practical uses. Craftspeople, artists, and writers all engaged with it in one way or another. While Europe frowned on indulgence officially, new tastes and discoveries made standards selective. Then global exploration carried it across oceans in all directions. Different powers integrated it into trade and industry, each framing it as a valuable asset history's gentle phrasing for practical gain. By the 19th century, its use shifted from widely accepted to carefully monitored. Practices evolved to suit work, craft, and daily needs, following the trends of the time. Scholars and artists documented it extensively. Then authorities grew uneasy and restricted it, since nothing alarms control like widespread calm and order. And here we linger, eras later, still discussing the same material. It endured rulers, thinkers, authorities, and bans. It supported work, inspired stories, and sometimes led to hours of quiet reflection. Humans keep attempting to manage it, but it always escapes grasp. One breath, one verse, one neatly wrapped slice of the past at a time. Rome 1480, a place so steeped in vice that even celestial beings might have covered their faces. Into this scented pit of authority and decay came Lucrezia Borgia, child of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, who would ascend to Pope Alexander VI. From her first cry, Lucrezia wasn't merely a girl but a living token in the games of power. Her father, Rodrigo, lacked moderation. He collected lovers, offspring, foes, and often overlaps. Her mother, Vanozza de Catane, was an enduring paramour, a Roman widow with drive and tolerance for men whose ethics aimed solely at gain. They had multiple children, but Lucrezia shone brightest, sharp, appealing, and conveniently useful. By the time she toddled, arrangements swirled around her. Picture being 6 and already pledged to seal pacts between houses you'd never seen. That was her world. Her early lessons skipped toys for oratory negotiation and seeming innocent while scheming subtly. Yet young Lucrezia wasn't cruel. Not then. Accounts paint her as elegant, light-haired, with beauty that inspired Renaissance odes before a fatal meal. Tutors drilled Latin melodies versus tools to craft the ideal spouse, or rather the ideal leverage. The Borgia name carried scandal's whiff, and Lucrezia, innocent yet, would bear its mark. As her father climbed to the papacy via gifts and shadows, the girl observed and absorbed. She learned in Rome virtue was ornamental and lasting, meant bending morals, alliances, and sometimes more. When Rodrigo took the name Pope Alexander VI in Vatican 1092, the Vatican gained not just a guide but a family enterprise. The sacred seat, once piety's bastion, or at least its facade, became Borgia extension. Like any Italian clan, that meant unions, wealth, and maneuvering fields where young Lucrezia would soon shine willingly or not. At 12, she was already bartered among Europe's nobles like a refined game piece. Her initial betrothal to a Spanish lord, Don Cherubino Juan de Centel, dissolved quicker than a papal vow of change. Her next suitor from Naples met a similar end when his value faded. Lucrezia's affections were diplomacy with gems. By 14, her father set her with Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a man double her years and half her wit. The tie was tactical, binding the throne to Italy's strong houses. The ceremony was opulent. Rome's elite feasted under painted vaults, raised fine cups, and overlooked the Pope's daughter as a breathing accord. Behind the grins and finery, Lucrezia performed impeccably, charming, proper, angelic in speech. Angels didn't endure long in Vatican schemes. Her spouse soon lost favor as Borgia ties shifted, and Borgia shifts often meant vanishing, stepping down, or sudden illness. Giovanni didn't wait for fate. He fled, claiming the Pope and Lucrezia shared a bed. Yes, he accused his wife and her father of that. A uproar that left Rome breathless and amused. Lucrezia, scarcely 16, became Europe's whisper, victim or siren, depending on the teller. But Borgias didn't fold under talk. They wove it into plans. The Pope voided the union for lack of completion, awkward for all. Giovanni shamed, Lucrezia unbound. The alliances rolled on. After her first bond erased by decree, Lucrezia had little pause. Her father, always juggling, plotted fresh. It arrived in Neapolitan elegance. Her next match, Alfonso of Aragon, a striking prince and bastard son of Naples' king. The link offered steadiness for papal lands and key ties in Italy's shuffle. Lucrezia, 17, now appeared truly content. Alfonso matched her age kind by reports pleasant to behold. A change from Giovanni's suspicions. They bore a son, Rodrigo, after her father, reminding all of the lineage at every chance. Briefly, the Borgias seemed almost proper, but propriety didn't thrive in Renaissance Rome. Alliances soured swiftly. Her brother, Cesare Borgia, charming, keen, sometimes lethal, deemed Alfonso expendable. In Borgia terms, that spelled end. One evening in 1500, attackers struck Alfonso on St. Peter's steps. He endured the assault remarkably, but recovering someone choked him. Witnesses pointed to Cesare's agents. Others murmured Lucrezia held the cord. Truth, like most Borgia tales, blurred between dread and hearsay. Lucrezia wept deeply, tears, perhaps for lost affection or fading influence. The Vatican blamed thieves. No one bought it. Rome's rumors boiled. The Pope's daughter, toxin wielder, widow of the Tiber. Guilty or not, her image sealed, yet she didn't break. She mastered fragility while enduring threats. She sought cloisters for thought, or as doubters said, to weather outrage. At 18, she'd wed twice, lost one husband, faced more accusations than many clerics. But the play continued. Her next union wouldn't just bolster family, it would shift her from papal tool to duchess. In 1502-22, Lucrezia became Ferrara's duchess, and remarkably not all recoiled. Her tie to Alfonso d'Este heir was desperate calculation. Borgias craved legitimacy after blood and whispers. Ferrara needed papal grace and dowry. All pinched noses and grinned. When she reached Ferrara, she arrived with carts of riches, cloths, attendants, players, and a name so tainted it might sour blooms. The Este, known for polish, puzzled over her. Talk said she hid venom in jewels, her scent laced with death, a hand kiss fatal. One verse claimed her smile, held paradise and perdition. Accurate enough for the era, but she didn't ruin Ferrara. She remade herself. Instead of turmoil, she brought refinement. Her court turned haven for arts and tunes, welcoming writers, thinkers. Even Machiavelli, hard to impress, noted her diplomatic poise. For a name turned curse, her shift neared wondrous. Her bond with Alfonso lacked warmth. He favored arms over talk, but it held. He valued her mind, let her handle matters in absence. She became the duchy's quiet envoy, bridging rivals with graceful words. Yet Roman shades lingered. Pope Alexander died in 1503 from tainted wine, meant for another, they said. Cesare's hold crumbled. Overnight, Borgia went from shielded to shunned. Lucrezia practical, softly distanced from her past. In Ferrara, she was Duchess refined, steady set to outlast haunting tales. And briefly she did. Rome's viper shed skin, revealing a woman of remarkable composure. But her world rarely stayed calm. By 1503's end, Lucrezia's rebuilt life cracked under sorrow. Her polished Ferrara gatherings, once filled with mirth, verse, discussion, grew quiet. The woman Europe labeled temptress, now marked by loss. Her son Rodrigo from Alfonso of Aragon died abruptly at 12. Living distant in Naples, news struck like a recalled blade. Letters detail her pain starkly. No solace remains, she penned, a trusted one, save dawn murmurs. The words felt human, not schemed. For one blamed for every vice, she seemed near holy in grief. But fate twisted further. 2 infants passed, health waned. Some blamed heart, others old toxins. Truth simpler. Births, strains, eras, poor care wore her. Yet even tragedy deepened her grace. She leaned to faith, not her father's fiery kind, but personal quiet. She wrote monks, funded retreats, prayed long. Court writers, once dubbing her Rome's snake, now called her the devout duchess. Her husband Alfonso, better with siege than sympathy, grew to value her strength. He sought her views again, though she ailed often. The twist unnoticed by few. The schema of poison and desire now stood for piety and calm. To watchers it seemed renewal. To her perhaps weariness. Politics, deaths, murmurs burned her essence. But she persisted. Her closing years showed even weakness let her hold the stage. No masks needed, just silent accounting with a myth. By 1518, Lucrezia Borgia no longer glittered as Ferrara's salon queen. She grew softer, quieter, yet compelling. Rome's gossips chased fresh tales, and in quiet she found rest. Days circled children, belief courts, daily rites without proof demands. Her eldest living son, Ercole, groomed for duke. She cherished him, letters soft with counsel, and fate's touch, as if sensing brevity. Her husband, Alfonso, settled into partnership. Whatever spark once was, became solid, respect or shared trials. Shadows remained, health fragile from births and tensions worsened. Fever's fatigue collapses left her abed days, but Borgia style she kept elegance in illness. Visitors called her peaceful, almost glowing, as body failed. In June 1519, her 10th labor came, the girl stillborn. Issues followed, fever took hold. Heiress care, greens, pleas, hopes offered little. As heat rose, she sought absolution, right solitude with her priest. Final accounts paint her steady, accepting firm, the reverse of pamphlets, Vatican lure. On the 24th of June 1519, Lucrezia Borgia passed at 39. Her closing words reportedly prayed for offspring and those who harmed her. Ferrara grieved truly. Verses mourned. Attendants praised kindness. Even doubters conceded she departed as true, faithful woman. Buried in Corpus Domini convent, a serene spot fitting her more than any ornate hall. In passing, she gained life's denial, quiet. Not rumor hush, but true leave alone peace. Death didn't close Lucrezia Borgia's tale. It eternalized it. Months later, Europe's prince, verses, records reshaped her into legend. To some, the ideal Renaissance fiend Pope's child dabbling in toxin desire plots. To others, the blameless toolwoman caught in nets by harsher men, truth both and none, as with Borgia's. Later writers loved her contrasts. Victor Hugo cast her fatal allure in 1833's Lucrezia Borgia. Donizetti operatized the myth, her voice rising in guilt and wrath. Painters showed golden locks, chill gaze, one hand on chalice, other on bone, half saint, half ender. Even Machiavelli, knowing her kin Cesare, implied her finesse rivaled princes. Yet her letters reveal different. Woman tender on children, convent ledgers, daily devotion, signing your devoted Lucrezia. No spite, no allure, just wit and sadness. Her myth endured for embodying Renaissance clash, grace and wrought charm and drive holy and wrong. She existed where men tainted realms, calling it statecraft. but as woman her smile bred doubt. The age pardoning popes for slay never pardoned her endurance. Centuries on scholars reclaimed her mortal side. Recent views see not Rome's demon but political endurer in impossible clan. She acted her part sans choice well enough for legacy captivating 5 centuries. Ultimately, Lucrezia Borgia became history's favored enigma with fine script. Saint or snake hinges on teller, but certain few women balance damnation and forever so elegantly. And in death the world whispered her name on. At the heart of ancient Rome, between the Aventine and Palatine, rose a tribute to frenzy and splendor, the Circus Maximus. Not mere field, it throbbed as Rome's core dust peril, wholly wild. Race days drew half the city. Over 200,000 crammed, tight yelling, perspiring, hoping their sight avoided early wreck. From afar the circus loomed sun-faded giant near 600 meters stretch within pure tumult. Senators lounged under fine shades, jewels flashing. Common folk hollered from stone seats, fluttering cloth bits, red, blue, green, white, their faction flags. Even the ruler leaned in at start, eager as any tradesman below. Horns sounded. Charioteers, youths bold over wise-gripped lions, murmured to Fortuna. Horses pawed, snorted, bronze gleaming. Then Mapper fell, the white cloth, and race burst. 12 teams surged, wheels rumbling, sand flying. Noise shook stone. Air, thick with effort, hides scorched oil. Crowds seized, chanting names, damning foes, clutching wages. Danger real. One bad spin at central barrier and driver hurled to seats or under hoofs. End came swift in circus, but glory too. Winning charioteer gained thousands love. Name echoed in inns weeks. To Romans, circus wasn't amusement. It was faith in motion. Each lap a dance with death. Each fall divine verdict. Where deities and betters met, rulers wooed crowds, poorest felt fleeting rule. As dust cleared, one fact rang. Rome breathed the race, sometimes perished too. If Circus Maximus was Rome's pulse, it split 4 ways: red, blue, green, white. More than teams, tribal bonds, political leans, emotional holds. Every Roman claimed the faction, noble or pauper. Wearing color wasn't style, it was creed. Reds fiery, quick-tempered, favored by workers. Whites evoked old wealth custom. Greens backed by traders, middle risers known for sly willing to sway outcomes with coin. Blues infamous patrons among elite senators, rulers. They stood for order, the unreachable. Factions weren't shouts at tracks. Full enterprises, bonds, coaches, backers, clerics, scouts, bought finest steeds from Iberia, Africa, trained drivers as fighters, kept webs rivaling spies. Some held cheer slaves, paid fans to outyell rivals. Supporter clashes common as races. Streets flared when favored lost foul or rival accused of tamper. Think modern sport brawls with blades and fire. Nero tried peace backing greens and blues, worsened it. All craved royal nod, none shared. For fans, win wasn't mere score. Identity, triumph meant taller stride home. Loss meant drowning in vines, swearing next vengeance. Young baptized in colors, spouses parted over rival loyalties. Duels sparked over green clipping blue wheel. Circus Maximus wasn't track. Rome's social field. When colors met, not horses clashed, empire's spirit did. To Circus Maximus throngs, charioteers were wheeled deities. Rock idols of old Rome loved, envied, often gone pre-30. Names rang through bars markets. Scorpus, Diocles, Porphyrius, men turning spinner laps to glory eternities. But glamour hid toil. Most charioteers, slave sport, young by factions drilled hard. Few won liberty via triumphs, fewer lived to enjoy. Training started stables. Boys harnessing 4 horses, 2 tons, muscle disorder, temper. Reins wastebound, fall meant drag till ground or halt. Chariot, light trap, wood leather, speed over safe. Drivers bent low, knees flexed, whipping precise while eyeing cuts. Balance key. Lean far, flip, slow, crush. Race turned nameless to star or track mark. Rewards tempted. Top driver earned thousands sesterces. Seasoned senator rival. Legendary Diocles retired 24 years with wealth feeding Rome, year or epic feast. Yet he knew each win cost. Bones snapped, horses lost, comrades gone, fans obsessed. Walls bore portraits, charms, mimicked likeness, prayers for safety. Some shrine gifts for idle win, locks, coins, or Roman-style curses on foes. Charioteers knew, not athletes gladiators wield. Race battle masked as game lab death flirt. In spectacle worship city dramatic end near as good as win. When Mappa dropped from hand, time paused. Gates flew 12, chariots leaped like beasts freed. Crowd roar hit thunder. 7 laps, 5 kilometers, roughly. Circus became speed, storm, dust, risk. Track, sand line, circled spina, divider, with statues, alders, pilfered Egyptian obelisks. Sacred marks lent divine play, men striving glory under godly watch, but no one pondered Apollo or Neptune mid-rattle. Survival first. Charioteers low reins, body wrap control whip, deadly accurate. Quadriga 4 horses moved single outer set pace, inner angle turn. One stumbled chariot shattered, deadliest mete spina ends posts. Here lives gambled inches. Skilled hugged stone wheel graze. Careless clip flew. Crashes, naufragia, wrecks, crowd thrill. Horses cried, wood broke, bodies tossed. Throng howled glee. Women swooned. Betters tore cloth. Rulers watched rapt. Fallen driver, no halt. Next, swerved debris, sometimes blocking rivals. Laps marked bronze, dolphins, eggs, along spina, simple tension builders. 6 down, 1 left. Crowd horse. Driver cross, dust shaken, trembling noise, heaven shaking. Not horse's skill. Rome, reckless, grand roar. Addicted. Beneath hooves, cheers another fight. Coins, oaths, fixation. Betting circus, not side, Rome's shadow faith. Senators, troops, bondsmen wagered, bound by fortunes fickle. Bookies roamed, stands, wax, boards, bets all. Winner hue, crash count, horse passed first. Spectators gave coins like god gifts, murmuring Fortuna hopes. She outranked Jupiter often, sums huge. Rich staked lands, one race, poor weekly pay for richest dream. Some won overnight. Others ended bare cloaks, sold debts. Gambler leaped from seats post-loss, common dramatic Romans admired. Charioteers in gamble, factions bribed hands, info. Sick horse hurt driver, loose wheel, whispers shifted odds. Rome turned cheat show. Betting, not money. Tribal war as sport. Faction fans, street rioted bad races, blaming graft gods' luck. One riot greens, blues torched city sportsmanship, not Roman. Caligula bet vast on greens, threatened losing driver end. Nero entered self-warned despite fall. Crowd new rig, pretending fun. At circus, money flowed, blood like both spilled. Crowd didn't watch, lived, bled, sometimes died. For Rome not gamble, destiny poorer odds. Before marble gods, cults stole focus, charioteers, true Rome stars. Lean tanned crash from void fame top generals. Portraits inns, names etched walls. Fans yelled louder legions. Gaius Appuleius Diocles, Michael Jordan of circus. Raised 24 years, faction switched like athletes' contracts. One near 1500 wealth, huge could feed Rome. Year throw history's priciest party. Scorpus greens, golden youth, dashing fast. 2,000 wins died, crashed 26. Crowd wept like fallen Jupiter. Tomb, victory, palm 1,000 times youth cheated. Not noble, but Romans ignored. Public love, defying society rigid. Slave rise above senator via daring. Freed outsiders, poor became idols, sheer bold. Most democratic worship empire, new. Fame brought excess. Villas, servants, companions, Weinbachig. Factions guarded like steeds, bribes, guards, sometimes poisoned ward rivals, fan groups, admirers, jealous bands. Team change riots like Caesar's side switch battle. Adored, hated, equal praised skill, cursed pride, mosaics, graffiti, eternal. For masses, these embodied Rome thrill, terror, glory, risk, promise, any low touch forever. In Emperor City, charioteers drew true roar to casual gaze, circus track. To Romans, political hard empire, crowd roar, not horses, loyalty, belief sway. Emperors knew, content, mob, quiet, keep with bread races, panem et circenses. Leaders funded races favor, grand games generous host. New rulers started lavish coins, showered stands holy water, crowd cheered gratitude brief enough, dagger-free backs, factions mini parties, patron senate palace, blues conservative high tax raises, Jupiter toasting, greens merchants poor, restless loud, rivalry turned lethal, riots tore quarter shrines, emperors sided, Domitian greens, Caligula dined blues, stables, Nero self-charioteer, all factions always won, crowd new rig but pretending fun, circus pressure release, tax hike, grain fail, no senate storm, boo ruler races, boos counted, bad show uprisings, Justinian learned Constantinople, hippodrome riots near Raised City, Rome scripted, others copied. To emperors, circus, gift curse, joy kept power, or ended rain afternoon. Each lap metaphor Rome, swift bright turn from ruin. Circus Maximus Rome, dazzling, brutal. Under cheers, music, destruction right. Races, life, death shows Romans' honest appetites found both thrill. Crashes, naufragia show core. Frequent spectators saw divine hand. Chariot spiner smash gods' fates. Horses screamed, wheels split, drivers rag tossed. Lucky quick trample. Unlucky dragged reins, still horses alone finish. Crowd cheered death over win. Circus no mercy. Mirror Roman, disciplined brave show over life. When driver crashed, audience rose, chant name, honor, hero gave all. Dead legends dust, wreckage, not sand, stain fed city hunger. Crews cleared between, drag shards, blood bones, while tunes drowned. Moments later, next race crowd joy anew, like tragedy erased. For violence, circus controlled mad. Romans prized order, even brute. Engineers timed laps exact. Priests blessed Spina, pre-event emperor, box ensured gods masses pleased. Balance, danger, decorum made immortal. People wanted not fun transcend. Fleeting part, larger, louder, bloodier. Dust settled, post last smells, sweat, wine crushed blooms, sent Rome addiction. Victory wreckage, circus gave need, alive feel. Near thousand years, circus thundered, hooves, cheers, empire beat. But Rome fade took spectacle, end no grand crash. Quiet ember dim in once lit dust, 4th century old gods lost. Christianity frowned on pagan bloodlust empires crumbled and the stadium fell into ruin. Yet even in ruins, the memory of the Circus Maximus echoed, a scar across the city, a heartbeat of a civilization that refused to stop racing no matter how quiet the streets grew. And now let's float forward a few centuries to France, where the royal drama becomes significantly more domestic, though no less deliciously messy. Eleanor of Aquitaine, or Ella Lanena as we'll call her for a slightly more sleep-friendly roll of the tongue, was born into immense wealth and culture in the Duchy of Aquitaine. She arrived in the northern French court like a spark in a library. Suddenly, everything could catch fire. Her first marriage to King Louis VII was supposed to unite piety with power. Instead, it gave us scandal rumor and the slow burn story of a queen who absolutely refused to be tamed. She had southern sensuality, intelligence that could make clerics sweat, and the ability to charm, terrify, and manipulate in equal measure. The French court buzzed with poetry, gossip, and affairs dressed up as courtly love, and Ella Lanena became the sun around which it all revolved. Of course, marriage being what it was in the 12th century, things got complicated. Louis, pious to the point of obsession, found himself increasingly frustrated with a wife who laughed at the court's dull religiosity. Elalanina, bored and ambitious, kept her own counsel, flirted politely, we are told with power and poetry alike, and eventually, after a particularly cold crusade, turned humiliation into opportunity by divorcing Louis and marrying Henry of Anjou, soon to be Henry II of England. Suddenly, she wasn't just a queen. She was a queen who brought half of southwestern France with her. Paris was scandalized naturally, and bishops blamed witchcraft. But Eleanina didn't need it, only timing, wit, and an astonishing tolerance for chaos. Her life with Henry II was a long, complicated shuffle of admiration, rivalry, and slow burning family drama. He was brilliant, temperamental, and controlling. She was twice as intelligent and infinitely more patient with nonsense. Their court was a theater of politics, poetry, and the occasional rebellion. Sons plotted against fathers, wives schemed against husbands, and Elelanena, ever the strategist, quietly orchestrated letters and alliances that could make or break kingdoms. When her sons eventually rose in revolt with her blessing, Henry's wrath was swift, brutal, and ultimately futile in the long term. She spent 16 years imprisoned, moved from castle to castle, like a dangerous relic, yet even behind stone walls, she remained present in every whisper, every rumor, every piece of poetry that circulated through European courts. By the time Henry II died in 1189, she was nearly 70, still sharp, still calculating, still utterly unbroken. Her son, Richard the Lionheart, took the throne, and one of his first acts was to release his mother. Imagine walking free after 16 years of imprisonment and immediately being expected to help run an empire. Of course, Eleanor handled it with grace. She governed, negotiated, raised funds for impossible ransoms, and generally reminded everyone that experience beats youthful bravado every single time. She even dealt with her other son, John, whose attempts at intrigue and petty rebellion were tolerated only because, well, he was a son. In her final years, she became a stabilizing force in a world otherwise defined by war betrayal and impulsive knights. She brokered marriages, reconciled nobles, and held sway through intellect alone. When she died at almost 80, she left behind a Europe that was politically tangled, emotionally messy, and historically captivated. Her tomb carved to show her reading a book perfectly encapsulates a life spent rewriting the rules, rewriting morality, and outliving almost everyone who dared underestimate her. And for centuries afterward, her influence lingered through her descendants, through scandal and poetry, and in the very way European courts remembered power, femininity, and intrigue. So that's our gentle drift tonight, from hooves in the sand to silk-draped intrigue, a slow glide through empire scandal, and the kind of personal ambition that quietly reshapes continents. And somewhere between the roar of the Circus Maximus and the whispers of Aquitaine, we can see the curious, often tragic, and endlessly human threads of history weaving themselves into stories that honestly are almost too entertaining to be relaxing almost. Even after Eleanor of Aquitaine regained her freedom, the world around her had not grown any simpler. If anything, it had grown more complicated, particularly because she had spent 16 years carefully observing, quietly planning, and thinking through every letter, alliance, and rumor that floated through Europe while Henry II was still alive. She emerged from confinement almost like a general returning from a campaign, fully aware that power was not something one inherited or seized with swords alone. It was something maintained with patience, cunning, and timing. She did not immediately demand crowns or armies. She did not storm courts with the air of someone who had been wronged. Instead, she allowed her presence to settle into the minds of those who mattered: kings, princes, bishops, and nobles. Each glance she gave, each word she wrote, carried more weight than any knight's blade. Richard the Lionheart, her eldest surviving son, was already accustomed to the language of war. Brave, impulsive, and restless, he had little patience for the subtleties of governance. He sought glory on distant battlefields and crusades, while Eleanor understood that kingdoms needed someone to hold them together when the fighting was done or when the fighting could not be avoided. The coordination of treasuries, the management of noble grudges, the quiet alliances that kept barons from revolting it was all Eleanor's domain. She moved as if she had been born for it, though in truth, centuries of courtly life had sharpened her instincts into something almost unnatural. Her daughter Matilda now married into foreign courts, sent letters that traveled slowly across Europe, each one carefully routed to ensure her mother's counsel reached distant ears. Eleanor replied with patience, subtle suggestions, veiled warnings. The courts of France and Castile, ever sensitive to her influence, began to respect it or fear it without her having to raise her voice. Even whispers about her earlier years, her marriage to Louis VII, and her forced separation from power seemed to amplify rather than diminish her reputation. People spoke of her as if she were a force of nature. The softest rumor carried the weight of a royal decree. Henry II, in the years before his death, had left a complicated legacy. He was a man of immense skill and ambition, yet prone to paranoia and suspicion, especially toward his own children. His sons Richard, Geoffrey, and John had been groomed with differing lessons, expectations, and ambitions, and each had interpreted his father's designs in their own way. Geoffrey, the middle son, had perished in the tournament, leaving Richard and John as the principal heirs. Richard, disciplined in war but indifferent to domestic affairs, left Eleanor with an enormous responsibility. John, clever but envious, was quietly accumulating grievances and plans that would later trouble the realm even more than any external threat. Eleanor, despite her age and years of confinement, did not hesitate. She moved between castles with authority, meeting with barons who might otherwise have ignored her, advising Richard when he returned from campaign, and watching John with a vigilance born of experience. She understood the peculiar psychology of the Plantagenets. Richard thrived on valor and spectacle. John thrived on intrigue and resentment, and the kingdom thrived only insofar as the mother of both could keep their ambitions in some form of check. When Richard embarked on the Third Crusade, Eleanor assumed the role of regent in practice, if not in title. The kingdom was strained, the treasury vulnerable, and the nobles restless. Her task was to keep the threads of authority from unraveling, while her son sought glory abroad. She negotiated payments, suppressed mutinies, and brokered peace among factions that would have fought each other over a chicken and a loaf of bread. Her capacity for diplomacy was as subtle as it was relentless. She never raised the sword, yet she moved armies, redirected loyalties, and stabilized the realm with a precision that would have impressed even the most disciplined generals. When news arrived that Richard had been captured by the Holy Roman Emperor, the situation could have plunged England into chaos. Instead, Eleanor assumed the role of savior. She coordinated the collection of an enormous ransom, 150,000 marks, a sum so staggering that the kingdom nearly bankrupted itself to meet the demand. She traveled across territories, negotiated with princes, and marshaled resources with the confidence of someone for whom failure was not an option. Chroniclers later wrote that she moved like a lioness for her cub, and the comparison was not exaggerated. Every letter she sent, every treaty she brokered, every coin she collected bore her unmistakable signature. Efficiency, determination, and the quiet insistence that England would not fall into disorder while she was alive. During this time, John, the youngest son, continued to observe, waiting for opportunity. He cultivated resentments, tested loyalties, and plotted small intrigues within the court. Eleanor, ever perceptive, understood his nature. Where Richard relied on courage and valor, John relied on calculation and at times petty cruelty. She tolerated him only because he was her son and because she understood that ignoring him would invite disaster. Her control over him was not absolute, but it was careful, calculated, and based on decades of understanding the subtle psychology of ambition, Eleanor's personal life during this period remained disciplined. She rarely sought companionship outside her children's courts, though she maintained the dignity and charm that had defined her throughout her life. Her reputation as a queen who could survive imprisonment, rebellion, and scandal without losing composure was solidified. Courtiers and clerics alike whispered about her influence, sometimes admiring, sometimes resenting, and occasionally fearing the quiet power she wielded. By her 70s, she had outlived nearly every contemporary who might have challenged her directly. She had survived kings, lovers, and political intrigue, and she remained the central pivot of the English Empire. Her influence extended beyond the immediate concerns of England. Through careful marriage alliances, she positioned her descendants across Europe. Her daughters' marriages into French and Castilian royalty ensured that her family would remain influential even in courts far removed from her own. Her understanding of dynastic politics was comprehensive. She recognized that power was not merely inherited but cultivated and maintained across generations. Each arrangement, each negotiation, each alliance reflected her long term vision of stability, influence, and survival. Despite these triumphs, Eleanor's life was not without sorrow. The deaths of her children, the rebellions that persisted, and the constant strain of governance weighed upon her. She bore witness to the fragility of kingdoms and the capriciousness of human ambition. Yet she endured as she had endured throughout her life. Every setback was met with patience, every betrayal with measured response, and every triumph with quiet dignity. Her longevity in power was remarkable not only for its duration but for its consistency and effectiveness in a world where most rulers were remembered for chaos or cruelty rather than for sustained competence. Even as she aged, Eleanor remained an active political actor. When Richard died from a crossbow wound during a siege, she moved swiftly to secure the succession and stabilize the realm. John ascended the throne, and Eleanor, though older and less physically capable, continued to exert influence through negotiation, correspondence, and careful management of allies. Her experience and reputation were indispensable in ensuring that England did not immediately descend into anarchy. During the final years of her life, Eleanor focused on securing peace and stability through strategic marriages and alliances. She arranged the marriage of her granddaughter Blanche of Castile to the French heir, a union designed to mend decades of conflict between France and England. This act was emblematic of Eleanor's lifelong strategy. She understood that true power often lay not in armies or gold, but in the careful management of relationships, loyalties, and perceptions. Even in her late 70s, she remained a central figure in European politics, her counsel sought by kings, princes, and bishops alike. Eleanor's death in 1204 at nearly 80 years of age marked the end of a remarkable era. She was interred at Fonderod Abbey alongside Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, her tomb depicting her reading a book, a choice that symbolized her lifelong dedication to intellect, strategy, and influence. It was not a sword, not a crown, not even a rosary, but a book reflecting the manner in which she wielded power, through knowledge, negotiation, and patient manipulation rather than brute force. Her legacy persisted through her descendants, whose actions continued to shape European history. Her influence on the nature of queenship, dynastic politics, and courtly life was profound. Royal women who came after her were no longer merely pawns. They were players capable of influence, negotiation, and when necessary, decisive intervention. Eleanor of Aquitaine had redefined the role of queenship, leaving behind a template of power, resilience, and strategic acumen that would echo through centuries. Even after her death, chroniclers, poets, and historians struggled to encapsulate her significance. To some, she was a figure of scandal and independence, a woman whose intellect and ambition challenged societal norms. To others, she was the embodiment of courtly virtue and strategic foresight, a stabilizing force in tumultuous times. Her life story became inseparable from the history of England, France, and broader Europe, and her reputation as a queen who outlived kings, survived imprisonment, and shaped dynasties, ensured that she would be remembered long after her tomb had settled into silence. The enduring fascination with Eleanor also lay in the contradictions she embodied. She was at once charming and commanding, patient and relentless, politically astute and emotionally shrewd. Her actions consistently reflected a deep understanding of human nature, power, and the fragility of authority. She outlasted her husbands, guided her sons, mediated dynasties, and manipulated alliances, demonstrating that influence could be wielded more effectively through intellect and patience than through sheer force. By the time the 13th century began, Eleanor's presence was still felt throughout European courts. Her methods of governance, her strategies for alliance and marriage, and her insistence on the centrality of female agency within political structures continued to inform the behavior of monarchs and nobles. Her life had redefined expectations for queens, reshaping both their potential and their perception in the eyes of men who had previously underestimated them. Even in death, Eleanor's influence lingered like the scent of incense in an empty abbey, subtle but persistent, shaping the actions of her children and grandchildren as they navigated the treacherous waters of medieval kingship. Her passing did not immediately simplify the landscape she had worked so tirelessly to stabilize. Instead, it left her sons and their courts to contend with the enormous void of authority and subtle guidance she had provided for decades. Richard the Lionheart had already been gone for a short while before Eleanor's final departure, leaving John as king, a man whose capacity for ambition outstripped his ability for wisdom and whose understanding of loyalty was frustratingly narrow. John was clever, yes, but clever in the manner of someone who mistakes cunning for capability, who believed threats could be neutralized by fear and frustration alone, rather than by negotiation or foresight. John's reign began as a continuation of the usual Plantagenet chaos, though he inherited a kingdom and empire that were already stretched thin by decades of warfare, crusading, and Eleanor's own relentless diplomacy. The Angevin Empire, sprawling from the southern coasts of France through the heart of England, was a patchwork of territories, each with its own laws, customs, and volatile nobles. Richard had been a lion on the battlefield, but his absence had left administrative duties neglected, and Eleanor had held those threads together only because she understood the subtle balance of power, loyalty, and obligation that a kingdom depended upon. Now, with her gone, John was left to contend with barons who had grown accustomed to her quiet authority, princes who remembered her influence, and a treasury already burdened by crusade and ransom payments. John's first instinct naturally was to assert his dominance, because why not? If a man has inherited a crown, he must by all medieval logic demonstrate that it fits. He demanded oaths of loyalty, convened councils to remind nobles of their obligations, and attempted to enforce authority through intimidation. Some barons acquiesced mostly out of habit or fear, but many quietly remembered Eleanor's hands in the kingdom's prior stability. She had understood that authority was earned over time, often in the smallest gestures of attention and subtlety. A well-timed letter, the strategic marriage of a niece, the careful mediation of a dispute over pasture land. John, by contrast, attempted to replace nuance with decree, and the results were predictably messy. While John mismanaged his kingdom, Eleanor's legacy continued to assert itself indirectly. Her granddaughters and sons, though loyal in name, carried seeds of her influence into their own marriages and courts. Blanche of Castile, Eleanor's granddaughter, moved into the French court, bringing with her not only the bloodline of the Angevin dynasty, but also an understanding of courtly negotiation that was unmistakably inherited. Blanche's upbringing had been infused with stories of her grandmother's clever interventions, her patience, and her strategies for controlling unruly nobles. Even years later, she would rely on these lessons, guiding France with a firm hand while maintaining the decorum and subtle authority that Eleanor had mastered. Meanwhile, in England, John faced increasingly vocal barons and restless nobles. The memory of Eleanor's rule lingered both as an example and as a standard he could never quite meet. He was quick to anger, prone to suspicion, and exceedingly skillful at alienating those whose loyalty he depended upon. Eleanor, who had spent her life assessing character and calculating long-term alliances, would have seen this coming decades earlier, but for John it was a revelation in real time. By the early 1210s, the kingdom was simmering with tension. Taxation, forced loans, and arbitrary punishments had made John deeply unpopular among his barons, and alliances that might have been stable under Eleanor's hand were beginning to fray. The rebellion that followed was almost inevitable. In 1215, the barons rose against John, demanding concessions, accountability, and protection of their traditional rights. The result was the Magna Carta, a document whose creation owes much to the groundwork Eleanor had laid. While John was not entirely pleased with the idea of being constrained by written law, the barons invoked precedents that she had established. The notion that royal authority was not absolute, that counsel mattered, and that wise negotiation could avert chaos. Eleanor had spent her life reinforcing these principles through example long before the ink dried on the parchment of Runnymede. Even during turbulent times, Eleanor's influence was evident in how her grandchildren conducted themselves. Prince Louis of France, who married into Eleanor's line through Blanche, approached political engagement with a level of decorum and patience that reflected centuries of Angevin strategy. Her daughters, meanwhile, continued to be conduits of power and influence, marrying into courts across Europe and ensuring that the Plantagenet network extended far beyond the shores of England and France. Eleanor had built a dynastic web that stretched across the continent, a lattice of marriages, alliances, and loyalties that outlasted her own lifespan. Back in England, John's challenges grew. The Magna Carta provided only a temporary framework for a kingdom facing significant tensions. Eleanor's memory was frequently invoked by chroniclers and advisors. Her name represented stability, reason, and the careful balance of authority that John had consistently struggled to maintain. The contrast was clear. Where she had acted with precision, foresight, and decisiveness, John often responded hastily, leaving matters unsettled. He clashed with the church, strained relations with foreign allies, and struggled with domestic management, all while trying to maintain cohesion among the barons who recalled Eleanor's skillful handling of similar situations decades earlier. Across the Channel, her other grandchildren and descendants were also making their mark. The political landscape of France and Castile continued to be shaped by marriages and treaties that traced their origins directly back to Eleanor's foresight. Her strategic acumen, honed over decades of experience in governance and courtly life, ensured that her bloodline remained central to European affairs, even as individual rulers proved inconsistent. The very fabric of diplomacy, the rules of negotiation, and the management of dynastic ambition carried her influence long after she had departed the world of the living. Eleanor's influence, therefore, was simultaneously political, cultural, and familial. She shaped the behaviors of her children, the strategies of her grandchildren, and the expectations of entire courts. She transformed queenship from a ceremonial role into an active instrument of influence, creating a legacy that survived long after her death and continued to shape European politics for generations. Even the chaos, rebellion, and mismanagement that marked her son's reigns highlighted the value of her lessons, proving in the harshest possible terms that Eleanor had been by far the most competent operator in a turbulent era. Her story, from imprisonment and scandal to political dominance and enduring influence, remained a touchstone for understanding the nature of power in the medieval world. Eleanor of Aquitaine had survived kings, rebellion, war, and intrigue, not through brute force alone, but through intellect, patience, and strategic foresight. The web she wove across Europe through marriage, diplomacy, and governance continued to influence generations long after her passing. Her life demonstrated that true power in a medieval monarchy was not simply inherited, demanded, or seized, it was cultivated, managed, and exercised with care. Even as the 13th century progressed and new challenges arose for the Plantagenet dynasty, Eleanor's legacy remained a quiet but omnipresent force. From the chaos of John's reign to the careful regency of Blanche of Castile in France, the lessons she imparted continued to guide the actions of kings and queens alike. Her influence extended through marriage alliances, diplomatic correspondence, and the careful cultivation of loyalty among nobles, demonstrating that even in death, Eleanor's strategic mind could shape the fate of nations. John's reign, as we already glimpsed, left a kingdom fraying at the edges, its barons deeply suspicious, its treasury under severe strain, and its continental possessions rapidly slipping from English control. Yet even as John flailed, the lessons Eleanor had imparted through decades of negotiation and strategic marriages remained a subtle presence in the political fabric. While he often ignored them, they did not vanish entirely. The very framework she had built, the network of alliances, the web of loyalties, the careful orchestration of familiar connections, continued to influence events whether John recognized it or not. The barons, weary of John's arbitrary governance, increasingly operated under the assumption that they could, if necessary, enforce limits on the crown. Magna Carta as a document was far more than ink on parchment. It was a manifestation of Eleanor's principles, a codification of restraint, albeit one she had never written herself. Her philosophy had always been subtle: negotiate, anticipate, and manipulate loyalties before disputes became rebellions. John, with his impatience and impulsiveness, ignored all of it, forcing nobles into repeated confrontation. This confrontation predictably bred instability. England during John's reign was a kingdom perpetually teetering between compliance and revolt. The king's efforts to consolidate power often backfired spectacularly. Harsh taxation, arbitrary imprisonment, and personal feuds with the nobility created an environment where rebellion was not just possible but probable. John's foreign policy was equally erratic. His losses in Normandy and other continental territories highlighted the limits of brute force without diplomatic finesse, a lesson Eleanor had internalized decades earlier and used to maintain a sprawling multinational empire. The contrast between her subtlety and John's blundering impulsiveness became increasingly obvious to chroniclers who noted with quiet judgment the disastrous consequences of his decisions. Meanwhile, Eleanor's daughters and grandchildren were quietly extending her influence across Europe. Blanche of Castile, in particular, was emerging as a model of strategic acumen. She had absorbed Eleanor's lessons on governance, alliance building, and negotiation, applying them meticulously to the French crown. Blanche's regency would later demonstrate in remarkable fashion how a single, capable woman could guide a kingdom, effectively maintaining stability during times when male rulers were absent, distracted, or incompetent. Her careful stewardship contrasted sharply with John's impulsive failures, proving that Eleanor's methods were not only enduring but also replicable even across generations. Back in England, John's handling of his barons led to growing difficulties, particularly in the years following the issuance of the Magna Carta. The document itself was repeatedly reviewed, adjusted, and at times overlooked. John's approach to leadership was guided more by personal concern than long-term strategy, a style that clashed with the nobility's expectation of careful governance. While Eleanor had cultivated loyalty through respect and deliberate influence, John sought compliance through pressure and insistence. The results were predictably challenging: disagreements among barons, political friction, and ongoing concerns about foreign relations. One of the most significant challenges came from French developments, particularly under Philip II. The change in control over Normandy in 1204 represented a considerable setback. Normandy had been one of Eleanor's valued territories, maintained through decades of careful alliance management and oversight. Its loss under John's hurried decisions highlighted the vulnerability of an empire without its central guiding hand, Eleanor. Philip's actions were facilitated not only by John's missteps, but also by the structures of influence Eleanor had established, which her descendants could still engage to support French interests when convenient. Despite these difficulties, Eleanor's strategic principles continued to shape the actions of her grandchildren and other descendants. Blanche of Castile, for example, carefully navigated dynastic matters, alliances, and political challenges, demonstrating the lasting impact of Eleanor's methods. Whereas John's reactive approach created tension within England, Eleanor's descendants applied diplomacy, thoughtful marriages, and measured negotiation to maintain, expand, and coordinate influence across multiple European territories. Her guidance, though no longer direct, remained a defining feature of 13th century politics. During John's reign, the barons' grievances escalated into outright rebellion inviting French intervention. Prince Louis of France, later Louis VIII, was invited by the disaffected English nobility to press claims against John, underlining the failures of John's governance. The chaos that followed reinforced the notion that Eleanor's approach, long-term planning, careful diplomacy, and management of noble loyalties was far superior to John's reactive, emotionally driven style. Yet, even in these crises, Eleanor's legacy persisted. The legal and dynastic structures she had influenced created avenues for negotiation, compromise, and stabilization, offering lessons in governance that John repeatedly ignored at his peril. As the decades passed, Eleanor's indirect influence shaped the political landscape of Europe. Her grandchildren were aware of her strategies and methods, and many consciously sought to emulate her approach to power. Marriages were arranged not merely for ceremonial purposes, but as instruments of strategic advantage. Alliances were cultivated carefully with attention to both immediate and long-term benefits. Even in times of upheaval, Eleanor's descendants demonstrated an awareness of the subtler levers of power, and understanding that she had spent a lifetime refining. Eleanor's legacy also shaped the legal culture of England. Magna Carta, though repeatedly contested and reinterpreted, reflected principles Eleanor had consistently applied throughout her life: the importance of negotiation, respect for the perspectives of powerful subordinates, and recognition that authority could not be exercised arbitrarily without consequence. Her indirect influence ensured that even in the midst of John's misrule, foundational ideas about governance, legal restraint, and noble rights persisted. Over time, these principles would come to define the English monarchy and legal tradition. John's reign, chaotic and often disastrous, underscored the contrast between impulsive rule and Eleanor's calculated governance. The losses he suffered, the rebellions he faced, and the eventual concessions he was forced to make highlighted the structural wisdom she had embodied throughout her life. Her methods were not just effective, they were durable. Even in her absence, they continued to shape the outcomes of European politics, serving as a silent benchmark against which the failures of her sons were measured. In France, Eleanor's influence manifested most prominently through Blanche of Castile. Blanche, acting as regent, demonstrated remarkable political acumen, maintaining stability, asserting authority over her nobles, and negotiating successfully with neighboring powers. Her ability to govern effectively during periods of uncertainty reflected the lessons Eleanor had imparted through example: patience, observation, strategic marriage, and careful cultivation of loyalty. Blanche's success underscored the enduring relevance of Eleanor's methods, proving that her influence extended far beyond her immediate lifetime. Eleanor's descendants across Europe also carried her strategic instincts in matters of marriage and alliance. Daughters and granddaughters married into key dynastic lines, creating networks of influence that connected England, France, and Castile. These unions were not merely ceremonial. They were strategic interventions that ensured the Plantagenet bloodline remained central to European power politics. Her careful attention to the political utility of marriage ensured that her lineage remained central to European power dynamics, even as individual monarchs like John struggled with basic governance. John's impulsive rule, combined with his failures in military campaigns and diplomacy, highlighted the value of Eleanor's measured strategic approach. Her lifetime of observation, negotiation, and calculated action created a blueprint for effective governance that her descendants continued to follow. Even as England faced instability, foreign intervention, and internal revolt, the structural principles Eleanor had established persisted, guiding political decisions and shaping outcomes in ways that were both subtle and profound. The interplay between John's misrule and Eleanor's enduring influence created a fascinating contrast in medieval European history, where John relied on coercion, fear, and immediate advantage. Eleanor's methods emphasized foresight, calculation, and long-term stability. The consequences of ignoring these principles were immediately visible in England's domestic and foreign crises, while the effectiveness of applying them was evident in the successes of her descendants, particularly in France. This dynamic illustrated the lasting impact of her strategic vision, which continued to shape the political landscape decades after her death. Eleanor's influence also persisted through her careful management of noble networks. By cultivating loyalty and establishing predictable channels of communication, she created systems that could survive her absence. Her descendants inherited these systems, which allowed them to respond effectively to challenges, maintain authority, and negotiate disputes. Even John's repeated missteps could not entirely undo the structural advantages Eleanor had embedded within the dynasty. The cultural and legal legacy of Eleanor's governance was equally profound. Chroniclers continued to reference her as a model of intelligence, diplomacy, and strategic foresight. Her name became synonymous with effective, patient, and sometimes ruthless management of power. Queens and princesses studied her example, even if only through the tales passed down by their tutors, advisors, or familial memories. Eleanor's life became a textbook of governance, diplomacy, and dynastic strategy, illustrating how influence could be exercised effectively without the constant need for displays of force. Even centuries later, historians recognized Eleanor's influence in the trajectory of English and French politics. The contrast between her disciplined, subtle governance and John's impulsive, often destructive rule offered enduring lessons about the exercise of power, the management of noble loyalty, and the importance of strategic foresight. Her legacy was not only political, but also cultural, shaping perceptions of queenship influence and authority for generations to come. Eleanor's enduring impact demonstrated that power could be exercised without constant displays of force. Through marriage alliances, careful negotiation, and strategic cultivation of loyalty, she created a framework that allowed her descendants to navigate complex political landscapes. Her methods proved resilient, guiding governance, diplomacy, and legal development long after her death. The contrast between her successes and her son's failures highlighted the effectiveness of her approach and ensured that her influence remained a defining feature of European politics. By the early 13th century, Eleanor's descendants had firmly established themselves as central actors in European affairs. Blanche of Castile's regency in France stabilized the kingdom. Her careful diplomacy and strategic marriages, ensuring loyalty and preventing rebellion. In England, the lessons of Eleanor's governance continued to influence political structures even as kings like John struggled to exercise authority effectively. The enduring presence of her methods demonstrated that Eleanor's influence extended far beyond her lifetime, shaping the course of dynastic politics across multiple realms. Eleanor's life had been a study in resilience, strategic foresight, and the subtle exercise of power. From her imprisonment under Henry II to her guidance of Richard the Lionheart, she had consistently demonstrated an ability to navigate complex political landscapes, manage noble loyalties, and influence outcomes without relying solely on force. Her legacy persisted through her descendants, shaping governance, diplomacy, and legal structures across Europe. Even in the face of her son's mismanagement, her strategic framework provided stability, guidance, and a model for effective leadership. The enduring relevance of Eleanor's influence was evident in the continued success of her descendants. Through careful marriages, diplomatic negotiation, and strategic management of noble networks, they were able to maintain authority, prevent rebellion, and assert influence across multiple kingdoms. Eleanor's principles, foresight, patience, and strategic use of power remained central to their approach, ensuring that her legacy shaped the trajectory of European politics for generations. Even in death, Eleanor's impact was visible in the structures of power she had created. Her influence extended through dynastic alliances, legal reforms, and the cultivation of loyalty among nobles. These structures allowed her descendants to navigate complex political landscapes, manage disputes, and maintain stability. The contrast between her strategic governance and her son's impulsive actions highlighted the enduring value of her approach, providing a template for effective leadership that persisted long after her passing. Eleanor's example also reshaped perceptions of queenship. Before her, royal women were largely ceremonial, their power limited to producing heirs and hosting courtly events. Through her strategic marriages, careful diplomacy, and subtle exercise of influence, Eleanor redefined the role of queens, demonstrating that women could shape political outcomes, manage complex networks of loyalty, and guide dynastic succession. Her legacy influenced the expectations of future queens and princesses, establishing a model for female authority in a male dominated political world. The Plantagenet dynasty, in turn, bore the imprint of Eleanor's governance. Her descendants continued to apply her principles even in the face of rebellion, foreign intervention, and domestic instability. Her strategic framework enabled them to assert authority, navigate alliances, and maintain stability across multiple realms. The enduring relevance of Eleanor's influence demonstrated that true power in the medieval world was not solely inherited or seized, it was cultivated, managed, and exercised with foresight and strategic insight. After John's turbulent reign finally settled into a semblance of order, with his death in 1216, the crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. A boy king surrounded by guardians, advisors, and a kingdom that had been wrung nearly dry by his father's mismanagement. Henry inherited far more problems than treasures. His minority meant that his rule was initially controlled by a council of regents, most notably William Marshal, a man of martial experience but limited patience for the intricacies of royal politics beyond the battlefield. The legacy of Eleanor of Aquitaine, however, remained an invisible hand shaping events. Though she had passed decades earlier, the structures, networks, and alliances she had carefully cultivated persisted, allowing a fragile framework for governance that her grandson could rely upon, at least temporarily. The early years of Henry III's reign were a lesson in the endurance of institutional memory. Magna Carta, though freshly signed and somewhat violated in the preceding years, became a critical point of reference for the regents. The document was less a symbol of defiance than a reminder of the structural expectations that Eleanor had long championed. That kings must negotiate with their barons, recognize limits on authority, and avoid alienating their most powerful subjects. William Marshal, acting on these principles, managed to hold together a fractious nobility and stave off the immediate threat of French interference, demonstrating that Eleanor's influence extended beyond her life in ways even she might have predicted. As Henry III matured into adolescence and early adulthood, the patterns of royal misjudgment familiar from his father's reign began to reemerge, albeit in a less catastrophic form. He was eager to assert authority, fond of lavish court entertainments, and occasionally impatient with the counsel of experienced advisers. Yet, unlike John, Henry had a lingering sense of the importance of negotiation, partially due to the indirect influence of Eleanor's legacy and partially due to the stabilizing effect of Marshall and other regents during his minority. His reign became a slow balancing act, asserting royal prerogative without alienating the barons who had already proven themselves willing to revolt. Eleanor's lessons were evident not just in legal and political frameworks, but also in the management of dynastic relationships. The marriages she had arranged, the alliances she had cemented, and the loyal network she had fostered across France and Castile provided Henry with options his father had lacked. These connections allowed for diplomatic maneuvering, particularly when external threats loomed. The French crown remained an ever-present concern, with Philip II's successors maintaining interest in English territories across Normandy and Aquitaine. Henry's ability to navigate these pressures was facilitated by the systems Eleanor had built, though his personal talents were limited in comparison to hers. The court of Henry III was both lively and precarious, reflecting the tensions between youthful ambition, inherited responsibilities, and the lingering expectations of Eleanor's political framework. Nobles were constantly weighing their loyalty against the risks of revolt, while the young king experimented with the trappings of authority. Eleanor's shadow, though unseen, was palpable in these interactions. Her methods of negotiation, marriage, diplomacy, and subtle manipulation of loyalty remained relevant templates even for a generation that had never seen her in person. Henry III's personal life mirrored the dynastic and political pressures of his era. His marriage to Eleanor of Provence was arranged with the strategic intentions characteristic of his grandmother's generation, though the young queen herself proved more politically active than John's consorts had been. Eleanor of Provence brought her own network of influence, complementing the Plantagenet's legacy while occasionally introducing friction with established English barons wary of foreign interference. This situation reflected a recurring pattern. Royal women, when empowered, often acted as stabilizing or destabilizing forces, depending on the context, a pattern Eleanor of Aquitaine had long understood and skillfully navigated during her own life. The young king's court was a stage for both continuity and experimentation. Henry, eager to assert his authority, often clashed with established advisors and barons, pushing the boundaries of royal power. These interactions were, in essence, a rehearsal of the lessons Eleanor had imparted through her life and her descendants' actions. Loyalty, diplomacy, negotiation, these were the levers she had wielded effectively, and now they were being tested against the temperament of a monarch less inclined towards subtlety. The tension between inherited frameworks and individual character defined the political landscape of England during the early 13th century. Eleanor's indirect influence was particularly visible in the management of rebellions and baronial dissent. When groups of nobles, dissatisfied with taxation, favoritism toward foreign advisors, or perceived mismanagement, raised grievances, the crown often relied on negotiation rather than immediate military confrontation. This approach, reminiscent of Eleanor's own methods in Aquitaine, and with her sons helped prevent England from descending into chaos during periods of youthful inexperience and political experimentation. While Henry's temperament occasionally undermined these efforts, the principles themselves remained sound. Over time, Henry III developed a reputation for stubbornness and a desire to impose his will traits reminiscent of his father John, but tempered by decades of Eleanor's indirect guidance. His approach to governance involved a careful balancing act, asserting authority while maintaining channels for negotiation and compromise. The young king's court was in many ways a laboratory for the practical application of Eleanor's political philosophy. Alliances forged through marriage, loyalty cultivated among nobles, and networks of influence spanning England, France, and Castile provided mechanisms for stability even as Henry sought to assert his individual prerogatives. Foreign relations during Henry III's reign remained a central concern. The French crown's persistent interest in English continental possessions combined with occasional Scottish aggression required a nuanced approach. Eleanor's legacy was evident here as well. Her methods of alliance, building negotiation, and strategic patience provided templates for addressing these challenges without resorting to immediate warfare. While Henry's execution of these principles was often inconsistent, the structures she had established enabled him to manage threats that might otherwise have spiraled into open conflict. The English nobility, ever vigilant against royal overreach, continued to exercise their influence, a phenomenon Eleanor had anticipated and managed deftly during her lifetime. The baron's ability to negotiate, press grievances, and influence governance reflected the enduring efficacy of her strategic vision. Through careful cultivation of loyalty and the establishment of predictable protocols for negotiation, Eleanor had created a framework that allowed her descendants to maintain authority while mitigating the risks of rebellion, a framework that Henry III, with varying degrees of success, continued to rely upon. As Henry III matured, his court became a more complex arena of competing interests. Nobles pressed for privileges, foreign advisors sought influence, and the young king experimented with assertions of power. Eleanor's influence, though indirect, persisted as a stabilizing force. Her principles, foresight, patience, and strategic cultivation of loyalty remained relevant guiding decisions even when Henry's personal inclinations occasionally diverged from her teachings. The result was a court that, while occasionally turbulent, maintained a degree of stability unparalleled in the reign of John. In addition to domestic governance, Henry's reign involved careful attention to the management of royal finances and territories. Eleanor's influence was particularly evident in the structuring of estates, the allocation of resources, and the negotiation of debts and obligations. Her emphasis on long-term strategic planning provided a model for managing royal finances, ensuring that the crown could sustain its obligations even amid periods of political and military uncertainty. Henry's execution of these principles was imperfect, but the framework she had established allowed him to navigate challenges that might have overwhelmed a less prepared monarch. The ongoing presence of Eleanor's principles was further evident in the marriage diplomacy pursued by Henry and his descendants. Strategic unions with continental houses reinforced alliances, secured claims, and provided mechanisms for resolving disputes without resorting to warfare. This approach, pioneered by Eleanor through her own marriages and those of her children, remained central to the Plantagenet strategy. By leveraging familial connections, Henry was able to extend influence, secure loyalty, and maintain stability, demonstrating the enduring practical value of Eleanor's vision. Even as challenges arose, Eleanor's legacy persisted in the cultural and ceremonial aspects of court life. The emphasis on ritual protocol and symbolic gestures reinforced her principles of influence and authority. By maintaining predictable structures of ceremony and etiquette, the crown could assert legitimacy, cultivate loyalty, and manage disputes with a subtlety that often proved more effective than direct confrontation. Henry III's adherence to these cultural frameworks reflected the deep and enduring impact of Eleanor's lifetime of political innovation. Over the course of decades, Henry III's reign demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of relying on inherited frameworks of power. Eleanor's principles provided tools for managing alliances, cultivating loyalty, and navigating complex political landscapes. Yet the execution of these tools depended on the personal capabilities of the reigning monarch. Henry's uneven application of these methods highlighted the contrast between strategic brilliance and human fallibility, underscoring the enduring wisdom of Eleanor's approach while illustrating the challenges of sustaining it across generations. The interplay between inherited structures and individual temperament continued to shape the Plantagenet dynasty. Eleanor's descendants, particularly her grandchildren, were increasingly aware of the necessity of balancing authority with negotiation, asserting influence without provoking rebellion, and managing dynastic relationships with foresight and discretion. These lessons, refined over decades of her guidance and experience, became central to the governance strategies of subsequent Plantagenet rulers, reinforcing the enduring relevance of Eleanor's vision. Even as England faced periodic unrest, foreign threats, and domestic challenges, the foundational principles Eleanor had established remained a source of stability. Her emphasis on strategic marriage, loyalty, cultivation, and negotiation provided mechanisms for resolving disputes, securing alliances, and maintaining authority. The effectiveness of these principles, demonstrated through the successes and failures of her descendants, underscored the lasting impact of her life on the political landscape of medieval Europe. Eleanor's influence extended beyond politics into legal and cultural domains. The principles she championed, respect for noble privileges, recognition of limits on royal authority, and the importance of negotiation, became embedded in the governance of England, influencing the development of law precedent and administrative practice. These principles persisted despite periods of misrule, illustrating the durability of Eleanor's contributions and their continuing relevance to the operation of medieval monarchy. The Plantagenet dynasty, shaped by Eleanor's legacy, continued to navigate complex political, military, and dynastic challenges throughout the 13th century. Her methods provided a template for effective governance, enabling her descendants to assert authority, maintain stability, and manage relationships across multiple kingdoms. The contrast between her strategic acumen and the occasional failings of her sons and grandsons highlighted the enduring wisdom of her approach, reinforcing her status as one of the most influential figures in medieval European history. Eleanor's life, therefore, remained a guiding example for her descendants. Her emphasis on foresight, patience, and the strategic exercise of power provided a framework for navigating the complexities of medieval kingship. By cultivating loyalty, managing alliances, and anticipating potential conflicts, she established principles that continued to shape political practice long after her death. The enduring relevance of her methods demonstrated the profound impact of her strategic vision on the Plantagenet dynasty and on the broader course of European history. The early years of Henry III's reign, despite careful regency and guidance, slowly revealed the difficulties of sustaining a kingdom long shaped by Eleanor's strategic hand. Young as he was, Henry had inherited not just a crown, but a network of obligations and fragile alliances. Each baron, each knight, each ecclesiastical figure carried memories of John's misrule and the uneasy peace maintained after Magna Carta. Henry's advisors had to work tirelessly to prevent these memories from turning into outright rebellion, a task made all the more complicated by Henry's impatience and occasional desire to assert dominance in ways that bordered on the impulsive. Eleanor's methods, though absent from court in person, were alive in the memory of the nobility. Subtle negotiation, careful reward and punishment, and the cultivation of loyalty that relied more on respect than fear. As Henry matured, it became increasingly clear that the ambitions of the barons, combined with the expectations of foreign courts, would test the limits of the Plantagenet system. France, still smarting from territorial disputes and past humiliations, kept a watchful eye on English holdings in Normandy and the contested regions along the southern coast. The French crown's interest in England's continental territories was a constant source of tension, and Henry, though capable of diplomacy, lacked the personal charisma or the political cunning of his grandmother Eleanor. His court became a delicate arena where the influence of advisors, the loyalties of nobles, and the subtleties of dynastic connections required constant attention. The first significant challenge to Henry's authority came not from foreign threats but from within. Barons, emboldened by the memory of Magna Carta and the instability of John's reign, began to press their claims more aggressively. They demanded the enforcement of rights, the limitation of royal taxation, and increased influence over court appointments. Eleanor's legacy was evident in the cautious approach recommended by the king's advisers. Negotiation, measured concession, and the maintenance of symbolic authority to preserve the king's legitimacy while avoiding outright conflict. Henry, however, struggled with patience, sometimes granting concessions only to retract them later, or asserting authority with a bluntness that alienated key allies. In this context, Eleanor's influence remained subtle but decisive. Her example as a queen who had wielded power through intellect, patience, and the careful orchestration of loyalty offered a model for navigating the complex web of English politics. Advisers reminded Henry implicitly, if not explicitly, of her approach, the importance of cultivating networks, the prudence of long-term thinking, and the value of personal diplomacy. Though Henry's execution was uneven, the very existence of these frameworks prevented the kingdom from plunging into the kind of chaos that had characterized the final years of John's reign. Henry's reign was also shaped by the broader European context. The legacy of Eleanor's children, particularly Richard the Lionheart and John, had created dynastic entanglements across France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Marriages arranged by Eleanor had bound England to distant courts, creating obligations and opportunities alike. These connections required constant attention, as political marriages, dowries, and claims to territories could easily spark disputes or wars. Henry, aware of these realities, relied on a combination of advisors and family alliances to manage these relationships, often employing the same mix of diplomacy and strategic patience that Eleanor had perfected during her own life. One of the most dramatic challenges of Henry's early reign emerged in the 1250s during what would later be termed the Second Barons' War. A coalition of increasingly assertive barons, frustrated with royal overreach and influenced by a sense of historical precedent dating back to Magna Carta, coalesced under the leadership of Simon de Montfort. De Montfort, an experienced soldier and politically ambitious nobleman, pressed for reforms that limited the king's authority, demanded regular councils of barons, and sought to ensure that taxation was sanctioned collectively rather than imposed unilaterally. His actions were, in many respects, the logical extension of patterns that Eleanor had understood and managed in her own life. Barons who remembered their rights, alliances that could be leveraged, and the strategic use of influence to shape governance. Henry III, faced with the prospect of organized opposition, initially attempted to negotiate, but his occasional impulsiveness and desire for unquestioned authority complicated these efforts. His concessions were sometimes granted in principle but withheld in practice or implemented with a delay that frustrated his allies. Eleanor's influence, though intangible, could be traced in the approach of his advisers, who consistently urged negotiation and patience. The result was a period of political tension punctuated by occasional outbreaks of localized violence, but largely characterized by a careful ongoing negotiation of power. Simon de Montfort's coalition was remarkably effective, in part because it exploited structural weaknesses that even Eleanor's foresight had not fully addressed. Henry's court, accustomed to symbolic displays of authority and formalized loyalty, struggled to respond to an organized political movement grounded in legal precedent and collective action. The barons' use of councils, petitions, and coordinated demands mirrored Eleanor's own approach to influence, a reliance on negotiation, communication, and the careful orchestration of power. However, unlike Eleanor, they were challenging the monarchy directly rather than supporting it, turning her methods into tools of opposition. As the conflict escalated, Henry III's capacity to manage the situation was tested. His advisors, drawing on the principles inherited from Eleanor's political experience, encouraged restraint, the careful building of coalitions, and strategic concessions. Henry, while occasionally receptive, also demonstrated the impulsive tendencies inherited from his father John, reactive decision-making, abrupt reversals, and a personal sense of affront that could override reasoned counsel. The tension between inherited strategy and individual temperament defined the course of the Second Barons' War, producing a slow-moving, politically complex struggle that relied as much on negotiation and influence as on military action. Eleanor's legacy was also evident in the role of royal women during this period. Figures such as Eleanor of Provence, Henry's queen, and later Blanche of Castile in France exemplified the ways in which female members of the dynasty exercised political influence through marriage, family networks, and strategic counsel. These women operated within a framework of expectation and precedent that Eleanor had helped establish. Royal women could be powerful actors shaping diplomacy, managing alliances, and mediating disputes. Their contributions during Henry III's reign reflected the enduring relevance of Eleanor's approach to power and the ways in which dynastic influence could be exercised through networks rather than armies. The culmination of the Second Barons' War demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of Eleanor's inherited strategies. Henry III eventually regained control in part through careful negotiation, the cultivation of loyalty among moderate barons, and selective concessions. The resolution of the conflict reinforced the principles of consultation, legal precedent, and measured authority that Eleanor had exemplified, even as it exposed the challenges posed by a monarch whose temperament did not always align strategic patience. The period left an indelible mark on English governance, solidifying practices of baronial consultation and institutional negotiation that would shape the monarchy for generations. Throughout this turbulent period, Eleanor's influence remained evident in the broader European stage. Her descendants continued to wield power in France, Castile, and the Holy Roman Empire, leveraging dynastic connections to influence diplomacy, succession disputes, and territorial negotiations. The network she had created, stretching across kingdoms and generations, allowed for coordinated strategies that often mitigated conflict and preserved stability. While Henry III's personal abilities were uneven, the structures and relationships established by Eleanor provided a framework that allowed for resilience in the face of internal and external pressures. The cultural impact of Eleanor's legacy also persisted. Courts across Europe continued to adopt conventions she had popularized, including ceremonial displays of power, structured courtly etiquette, and the integration of strategic marriages into broader political calculations. Her methods of cultivating loyalty, shaping influence, and negotiating authority became part of the political fabric, guiding the actions of monarchs, advisors, and nobles alike. The endurance of these practices highlighted the depth of her impact, demonstrating that her strategies were not limited to her own lifetime but continued to shape governance across generations. As Henry III aged, his reign increasingly reflected the delicate balance between inherited strategy and personal inclination. While he achieved notable successes in diplomacy, territorial management, and institutional development, his impulsive decisions, occasional favoritism, and disputes with barons demonstrated the ongoing challenge of translating Eleanor's lessons into consistent practice. Nevertheless, the principles she had instilled, patience, negotiation, strategic alliance building, remained central to the monarchy's ability to endure and adapt. The later years of Henry III's reign also highlighted the importance of dynastic continuity. Eleanor's emphasis on strategic marriage and the cultivation of heirs ensured that her lineage remained politically relevant across multiple kingdoms. The careful placement of her grandchildren and great-grandchildren in positions of influence allowed the Plantagenets to maintain a network of authority that extended beyond England's borders. This continuity reinforced the durability of her strategies, demonstrating the foresight with which she had approached questions of succession, loyalty, and long-term stability. Even as domestic and foreign pressures continued to challenge the monarchy, Eleanor's legacy provided a stabilizing influence. Advisors, nobles, and royal family members all operated within a framework shaped by her strategies, balancing negotiation with authority, loyalty with accountability, and diplomacy with strategic assertiveness. The cumulative effect of these practices allowed Henry III and subsequent monarchs to maintain continuity, manage crises, and navigate the complexities of medieval European politics with a degree of stability that might otherwise have been unattainable. Eleanor's influence extended to the management of legal institutions as well. Her insistence on negotiation, consultation, and respect for precedent informed the development of courts, charters, and administrative practices. These institutions became central to the governance of England, providing mechanisms for resolving disputes, regulating taxation, and asserting royal authority without resorting to arbitrary force. The principle she had championed, careful attention to detail, strategic patience, and the cultivation of loyalty, remained embedded in these institutions, guiding their evolution and ensuring their enduring relevance. As the 13th century progressed, the Plantagenet dynasty continued to face challenges, but Eleanor's legacy remained a guiding force. The patterns of influence she had established through marriage, diplomacy, negotiation, and strategic alliances provided a durable framework for governance, allowing her descendants to navigate political, military, and dynastic complexities. Her life, though concluded decades earlier, continued to shape the strategies, priorities, and decisions of English monarchs, demonstrating the profound and lasting impact of her approach to power. Henry III, now firmly in his middle years, began to feel the weight of both his crown and the memory of his ancestors. It's worth noting gently that Henry's temperament had a tendency to vacillate between stubbornness and indecision. Some chroniclers described him as a king of immense patience, though with a streak of indulgence that could test even the most loyal of advisers. Eleanor's shadow, long since receded from the palace walls, still hovered over these corridors in the form of institutional precedent. She had taught implicitly that power was as much about perception as it was about action, that a king could not simply command obedience, but must cultivate it subtly, persistently. Henry understood this in theory, though in practice his impatience often undermined the lessons. During these years, tensions with the barons did not fade, and the memory of Simon de Montfort's rebellion remained a fresh cautionary tale. Henry, attempting to cement his authority, occasionally overreached, appointing favorites to lucrative positions or granting lands in ways that created resentment. Eleanor's approach would have been more cautious, reward loyalty, certainly, but measure each action against long-term consequence. Henry's decisions, by contrast, sometimes appeared haphazard, though he did manage to learn slowly from missteps. Advisors who had survived the earlier conflicts leaned on Eleanor's methods, reminding the king that influence and negotiation often yielded more stability than force or truth. Henry gradually internalized as he aged. Eleanor's legacy manifested most tangibly through her descendants, who continued to interweave England into the broader fabric of European politics. Marriages, arranged decades earlier, created obligations and opportunities that demanded careful management. England's position on the continent, particularly regarding Gascony, Aquitaine, and the contested territories in France, required constant attention. Henry's foreign policy, often cautious and reactive, reflected an awareness of these obligations. He sought to honor treaties, maintain alliances, and prevent encroachments by France, though with varying degrees of success. Eleanor's strategy of leveraging dynastic ties remained a model, even as the practical execution fell to her grandchildren. The later years of Henry III's reign were punctuated by sporadic rebellion, baronial petitions, and disputes over taxation. These conflicts, though less violent than earlier uprisings, reflected the enduring challenge of balancing royal authority with the growing power of the nobility. Eleanor's influence, though absent in person, could be seen in the continued use of negotiation, the cultivation of loyalty, and the recognition that a monarch's power relied on more than mere military strength. Even in her absence, she had shaped the political culture of England, embedding strategies that moderated conflict and encouraged stability. One of the most consequential events of Henry III's later reign was the death of Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. Montfort, who had once commanded a broad coalition of barons and held de facto control over England, was killed decisively, leaving a vacuum in opposition and reaffirming royal authority. The king's response was cautious. He avoided excessive reprisals, opting instead for measured reconciliation. This restraint was again in the spirit of Eleanor's approach, maintaining authority without provoking further unrest. It was a recognition, however, perhaps subconscious, that long-term stability required more than the elimination of immediate threats. Following Montfort's defeat, Henry gradually reasserted control, though he remained aware of the delicate balance required to govern effectively. The barons, now more restrained but still influential, continued to exercise their rights and influence shaping policy through negotiation and legal precedent. Henry's court, informed by the practices of his grandmother, became a hub of careful political management where alliances were nurtured, disputes mediated, and authority exercised with an eye toward long-term consequences. Eleanor's lessons had been absorbed, if not perfectly executed. Patience, negotiation, and the cultivation of loyalty were central to maintaining power. As Henry's reign progressed into the 1270s and 1280s, he faced the practical realities of aging governance and succession. The question of heirs remained central both for the stability of England and the maintenance of dynastic influence across Europe. Edward, his son and heir, had been groomed with an awareness of these responsibilities. Eleanor's enduring influence, transmitted through familial networks, courtly precedent, and dynastic example, informed Edward's education and political development. He was instructed not only in martial skill but in diplomacy, negotiation, and the subtle exercise of power, a blend of lessons designed to prepare him for the challenges of kingship. Edward, later known as Edward I, inherited a kingdom shaped in no small part by Eleanor's strategic vision. The consolidation of royal authority, the management of baronial expectations, and the maintenance of continental obligations had all been informed by practices she had established. By the time Edward ascended the throne in 1272, the monarchy was both stronger and more intricately entangled with European politics than it had been at the end of Henry III's early reign. Eleanor's influence, though indirect, provided a framework that allowed Edward to navigate these complexities with a degree of competence that his father had only partially achieved. Edward's reign, though outwardly focused on military campaigns and territorial expansion, was deeply informed by dynastic considerations. Eleanor's approach to power, strategic marriage, cultivation of loyalty, and careful negotiation remained central to the management of relationships both within England and across the continent. The placement of children and grandchildren in politically advantageous positions, a practice Eleanor had perfected, allowed Edward to leverage family connections to bolster alliances, manage potential conflicts, and secure the crown's interests abroad. Even the administration of justice, the management of finances, and the orchestration of ceremonial authority were influenced by practices she had established decades earlier. During this period, the influence of royal women continued to be evident. Figures such as Eleanor of Castile, Edward's queen, embodied the principles of dynastic management, courtly influence, and political counsel that Eleanor had championed. These women exercised authority in subtle ways, negotiating disputes, advising their husbands, and cultivating networks of loyalty. The model established by Eleanor, intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight as tools of influence, remained central to the functioning of the monarchy. Royal women could shape policy, mediate conflict, and ensure dynastic continuity without ever wielding the sword directly. Edward I's campaigns in Wales and Scotland, while militarily focused, were also deeply connected to dynastic and political strategy. Eleanor's legacy was evident in the careful orchestration of alliances, the negotiation of oaths of fealty, and the management of conquered territories. Authority was not merely asserted through force. It was reinforced through legal recognition, strategic marriages, and the careful cultivation of loyalty among local elites. Eleanor's influence, though indirect and long removed from her lifetime, continued to shape the methods by which power was exercised across the realm. In addition to political and military concerns, cultural and administrative structures established or reinforced under Eleanor's influence continued to shape England's governance. Courts, legal institutions, and the administration of justice reflected principles she had championed. Careful attention to precedent negotiation as a tool of authority and the integration of familial and dynastic considerations into governance. The enduring influence of these practices provided continuity, stability, and a degree of predictability that allowed monarchs such as Edward I to govern effectively across decades of complex political challenges. Eleanor's broader European legacy remained equally significant. Her descendants across France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire continued to shape continental politics, weaving a web of alliances, obligations, and dynastic influence that allowed England to maintain strategic leverage in Europe. These connections, carefully cultivated over decades, ensured that her lineage remained politically relevant, providing channels for negotiation, alliance, and influence that extended far beyond the borders of England itself. Even as Edward I consolidated power, Eleanor's methods offered lessons in restraint, patience, and strategic foresight. The balance between asserting authority and cultivating loyalty, between enforcing rights and negotiating compliance, continued to define effective governance. Monarchs who ignored these lessons, those who relied solely on force or impulsive judgment, often found themselves facing rebellion, instability, or diplomatic isolation. Eleanor's strategies, developed through a lifetime of political engagement, imprisonment, and negotiation, remained a touchstone for her descendants, guiding both policy and practice in the complex world of medieval European politics. Throughout these decades, the memory of Eleanor's life, her intelligence, her resilience, and her skill in maneuvering through dynastic crises remained present in both courtly culture and the historical record. Chroniclers, often fascinated by the blend of scandal, intellect, and strategy that had defined her life, preserved accounts of her influence, her marriages, and her political maneuvers. Her example continued to shape the expectations of royal behavior, the role of women in governance, and the strategies employed by monarchs navigating the complex intersection of family politics and power. Even as successive generations faced new challenges, the rebellions of barons, disputes over succession, conflicts with neighboring states, the principles established by Eleanor persisted. Authority was exercised through negotiation, as well as forced loyalty was cultivated rather than demanded, and dynastic continuity was carefully managed through marriage alliances and strategic counsel. The lessons of her life, absorbed consciously or unconsciously by her descendants, provided a framework for navigating the complexities of medieval rule that proved remarkably resilient across decades of political turbulence. The enduring influence of Eleanor of Aquitaine, therefore, can be traced not only in the actions of her immediate descendants but also in the broader political and cultural patterns of England and Europe. Her emphasis on strategic foresight, patient negotiation, and the cultivation of loyalty became embedded in the institutions, practices, and expectations of governance, shaping the monarchy and the broader aristocratic culture for generations. Even long after her death, her approach to power, subtle, persistent, and intellectually rigorous, remained a model for navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics. By the turn of the 14th century, Eleanor's legacy had firmly taken root. England, though, still subject to the tensions of baronial rights, dynastic ambition, and continental diplomacy, operated within a framework that bore the imprint of her strategies. Royal authority was exercised with an awareness of precedent, an appreciation for negotiation, and a recognition of the importance of cultivating loyalty principles that would continue to guide monarchs well beyond her lifetime. In every council meeting, diplomatic negotiation, and dynastic marriage, the subtle influence of Eleanor of Aquitaine could still be felt, a testament to the enduring power of intellect, patience, and strategic foresight in the world of medieval politics. Edward's later years were marked by the kind of meticulous planning that Eleanor of Aquitaine would have quietly admired. He had spent decades consolidating power, asserting control over Wales, and attempting to bring Scotland into his sphere of influence. His campaigns, though militarily impressive, were also carefully interwoven with dynastic strategy. He ensured that his children were placed in advantageous marriages, that loyal nobles were rewarded with lands and offices, and that potential threats were neutralized through negotiation whenever possible. It is tempting, of course, to imagine Eleanor nodding approvingly from beyond, satisfied that her lessons in patience, calculation, and subtle influence had not been forgotten by her grandson. Edward's queen, Eleanor of Castile, remained an equally steady influence. The two Eleanors, one the mother of kings, one the queen beside, one represented a continuity of women exercising power through intellect, counsel, and strategic foresight. Queen Eleanor, unlike many consorts of her era, took an active role in administration, in maintaining courtly order, and in shaping the education and marriages of her children. It was not a flamboyant or ostentatious authority. Rather, it was the kind of steady, quiet influence that stabilized kingdoms. The overlap of Eleanor of Aquitaine's legacy with that of Eleanor of Castile created a matrilineal thread of power threading patience, strategic foresight, and careful negotiation through decades of English history. Edward's campaigns in Scotland, while militarily successful at first, revealed the limits of even the most careful planning. Resistance there was, persistent, rooted in local loyalty and a complex web of allegiances. Yet the principles inherited from Eleanor, cultivating loyalty where possible, negotiating when force failed, and maintaining the legitimacy of rule through dynastic continuity, continued to guide Edward's approach. Even when battles were lost or sieges prolonged, the overarching strategy remained coherent. The crown was not merely to be defended, but embedded within a network of alliances, family ties, and careful administration. During these years, the influence of Eleanor's lineage spread not only through her direct descendants, but through the broader European aristocracy. Marriages between Plantagenets and Capetians, as well as ties to Iberian and Holy Roman families, ensured that England's royal house remained entangled with the continent. These connections, carefully cultivated over decades, allowed for diplomacy, negotiation, and strategic maneuvering that extended far beyond the battlefield. Eleanor's approach to power, patient, deliberate, and reliant on influence, as much as force, remained central to this extended network. Her descendants, whether aware of it or not, continued to employ the strategies she had perfected, marriage negotiation, and the cultivation of loyalty as instruments of enduring authority. The death of Eleanor of Castile in 1290 marked a quiet but profound turning point in Edward's reign. Her loss, while deeply personal, also removed a stabilizing influence at court. Edward, by all accounts, was deeply affected, mourning in a manner that revealed both personal attachment and recognition of her political significance. Her death left Edward to manage the kingdom largely on his own, though the principles instilled by Eleanor of Aquitaine, patience, strategic foresight, and careful negotiation remained embedded in his methods. The careful balance of authority, loyalty, and dynastic foresight she had championed lived on, now exercised entirely through her grandson and his administration. As Edward aged, attention turned increasingly toward the succession of his own heirs. His son Edward II, while destined to inherit the throne, lacked the tactical patience and strategic foresight of his grandfather. This disconnect would in time create the conditions for instability that Eleanor of Aquitaine had long sought to mitigate through careful management of her descendants. Nevertheless, the structures she had helped establish, dynastic alliances, careful cultivation of loyalty, and recognition of the importance of marriage and negotiation, continued to shape the political landscape, offering some measure continuity amid the inevitable turbulence of generational change. Edward I's death in 1307 brought Edward II to the throne, a transition that revealed both the strengths and limitations of Eleanor's legacy. While her strategies had provided a framework for governance, they could not fully compensate for personal failings, temperament, or the changing nature of political and military challenges. Edward II's reign was marked by favoritism disputes with the nobility and challenges to royal authority. Yet even here the shadow of Eleanor's influence persisted. The importance of dynastic marriage, the cultivation of loyalty, and the recognition that power could be exercised subtly, not merely through force, continued to guide advisors, courtiers, and occasionally the king himself. Throughout Edward II's reign, England's political landscape remained shaped by the dynastic threads woven by Eleanor. Her descendants, married into powerful continental families, continued to exert influence across Europe, creating obligations, alliances, and rivalries that demanded careful management. Even as rebellion and political instability emerged at home, the structural foundation she had helped establish provided a degree of resilience. Nobles and barons familiar with the traditions of negotiation, loyalty, and dynastic strategy she had championed engaged with the crown within a framework shaped in no small part by her enduring legacy. The deposition of Edward II in 1327, orchestrated by his wife Isabella of France and her lover Roger Mortimer, demonstrated both the fragility and persistence of dynastic influence. While the king's personal failings facilitated his removal, the broader structures of governance, inheritance, and dynastic legitimacy principles rooted in Eleanor's methods remained intact. Edward III, installed as a young king under regency, inherited a kingdom shaped by generations of strategic marriage negotiation and the careful cultivation of loyalty. Eleanor's legacy, though distant by this point, continued to shape the exercise of royal authority, providing a framework for stability even in the midst of personal and political upheaval. Edward III's reign would, over the course of decades, transform England into a major European power. Yet even amid military campaigns, territorial expansion, and the beginnings of the Hundred Years' War, the principles instilled by Eleanor's influence remained evident. Alliances through marriage, careful negotiation with barons, and the cultivation of loyalty and legitimacy continued to underpin royal authority. The enduring impact of Eleanor of Aquitaine, exercised through generations of descendants, demonstrated the subtle but profound ways in which a single individual could shape the political and dynastic trajectory of an entire kingdom. Throughout these centuries, Eleanor's name and memory continued to carry weight. Chroniclers, historians, and poets alike preserved accounts of her life, her marriages, and her political acumen. Stories of her intelligence, patience, and strategic foresight circulated not only as historical record, but as exemplars of royal conduct. Her influence extended beyond immediate descendants, shaping expectations of monarchy, the role of royal women, and the exercise of power across England and continental Europe. Even those who opposed her descendants were often constrained by the dynastic structures she had helped create. By the mid 14th century, England had become a complex web of dynastic alliances, continental obligations, and internal governance structures, many of which traced their origins to Eleanor's careful orchestration of marriages, loyalty networks, and political precedent. Her influence, exercised indirectly through generations, provided a measure of continuity amid the turbulence of rebellion, war, and succession disputes. The stability of the monarchy, the management of baronial expectations, and the negotiation of continental diplomacy all bore the imprint of her strategic foresight. In the end, Eleanor of Aquitaine's enduring legacy lay not in the battles fought by her descendants, nor in the kingdoms they conquered or defended, but in the structures of power, influence, and dynastic strategy she had established. Her life, marked by marriage, imprisonment, political maneuvering, and the careful cultivation of alliances, provided a blueprint for generations of monarchs and royal women. Her influence, though often indirect and subtle, continued to shape the governance, diplomacy, and succession of England and its continental holdings for decades after her death. By the close of the 14th century, the shadow of Eleanor's intellect, resilience, and strategic foresight remained evident across the Plantagenet dynasty. The lessons she imparted, embedded in both institution and practice, ensured that royal authority could endure even amid rebellion, personal failings, and the shifting tides of political fortune. The web of dynastic connections she had woven extended across Europe, creating a framework within which her descendants could exercise power, navigate alliances, and sustain the monarchy across generations. Even centuries later, historians would marvel at the subtlety and persistence of her influence. Eleanor of Aquitaine had not merely lived through the crises of her era. She had shaped them, guided them, and ensured that her family, her dynasty, and her legacy endured long after the stone walls that once imprisoned her had crumbled. She remained, in every sense, a master of strategy, patience, and influence. A queen whose life, long and storied, continued to define the possibilities of power, intellect, and resilience for generations of rulers who followed in her footsteps. Her tomb, serene and dignified, reading a book rather than a sword, remains a fitting monument, not to conquest or war, but to a mind that navigated centuries of dynastic intrigue with subtlety, patience, and enduring brilliance. Eleanor of Aquitaine's story, from queen to prisoner to matriarch and architect of dynastic strategy, is a testament to the quiet, persistent, and ultimately unstoppable power of intelligence, resilience, and foresight in a world dominated by swords, crowns, and ambition.